The road into Rome still carries carts, animals, tax grain, gossip and dust. Dawn comes over cracked walls and tiled roofs with the same pale light that once touched triumphal processions and senators in white. Bells do not ring here yet in the way later centuries will know them, but sound is everywhere. Iron on stone mark its shutters, lifted soldiers called to movement, the creak of harness leather, the mutter of traders who still think the world has a centre, and that this city, despite everything, remains it. There is no single moment when a watching crowd gasps and sees an empire die. There is no clean cinematic snap in which Rome simply collapses into ruin, like a burned roof giving way in one shower of sparks. That is the comforting picture, the neat picture the one later ages prefer, because it makes history feel orderly. But the truth is darker and far more unsettling. The Roman Empire, at least in the West, does not simply fall under its own exhausted weight. It is cut apart, consumed, looted, starved, betrayed and dismantled piece by piece, while millions of people inside it go on farming, praying, trading, petitioning, repairing roads, collecting taxes and obeying laws written in the name of emperors they will never see. The unsettling part is not that Rome proves mortal. Everything built by human hands is mortal. The unsettling part is how long the structure stays standing while the damage spreads through it, how long its language of power survives after the power itself has begun to rot, and how many people continue to live inside the system without fully grasping that the system is being destroyed around them. Marble still shines in places, aqueducts still carry water, officials still stamp orders with authority, grain still arrives sometimes, armies still march beneath Roman standards, though not always under Roman discipline, not always in Roman interests, and increasingly not with Roman certainty. The maps still suggest command from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Yet maps lie in the way institutions lie by preserving the shape of things longer than their substance. It helps to begin not at the neat end date schoolbooks like to recite, but in the mood of the late empire itself. It is a world of immense durability and growing unease. The Roman state remains one of the most formidable political machines the ancient world has ever produced. It taxes on a continental scale. It moves armies over staggering distances. It feeds giant cities. It maintains law courts, arsenals, workshops, archives, and bureaucracies so intricate that entire provinces can seem to exist for the purpose of supplying another province. It binds together peoples who do not share a native language, a local god, or a common ancestry, and persuades them, coerces them, or simply accustoms them into living within a single imperial order. A peasant in Gaul, a merchant in Carthage, a soldier on the Danube and a bishop in Italy inhabit very different worlds, yet all know in one form or another what Rome is. That alone is extraordinary, and yet the evidence remains incomplete about how ordinary people understood the danger gathering around them, because the surviving record tilts toward the literate and the powerful. What survives in the record suggests anxiety, complaint, blame, and confusion far more than simple certainty. There are sermons about sin and punishment laws against corruption, and tax evasion letters filled with fear of raids, treatises lamenting moral decline, petitions about abuses by officials, accounts of refugees, arguments over military spending, desperate appeals to distant courts, and pious attempts to explain disaster as judgment. Some of that is rhetoric. Roman elites always complained. Every age imagines itself in decline. But beneath the familiar tone of moral panic sits something more concrete and more dangerous, the steady erosion of the empire's ability to convert its size into security. Seen from far enough away, Rome can look eternal. Seen up close, it is always under repair. Roads crack. Walls need stone, garrisons need pay, ships need timber, horses die, harvests fail. Ambitious men gather clients and flatter troops and dream of purple. Borders must be watched, grain must be measured, coinage must be trusted, law must travel faster than rumour. An empire this large is not a monument, it is a process. It survives because countless moving parts continue to function at once. That is why its destruction is not a single event, but a sustained assault on connection itself. Break the roads, seize the tax base, turn generals against one another, strip frontier armies from the borders, disrupt grain fleets, devastate provinces, shatter confidence in pay and command, and the empire begins to fail, not dramatically at first, but administratively, then logistically, then psychologically, and finally politically. By the time monuments are burning, something deeper has already happened. The old image of decline and fall has a certain tragic elegance, but it can flatten the human reality into something too passive. Decline suggests tiredness, fall suggests gravity. Both words can imply inevitability, as though Rome merely aged and tipped over. There is some truth in the idea that internal weakness matters. Of course it does. No state can be destroyed from outside alone if it remains coherent within. Scholars still debate the balance of causes: military overreach, taxation, plagues, civil wars, demographic strain, religious change, climate instability, dependence on coercion, elite self-interest, frontier pressure. No single explanation fully accounts for this history, but if the word collapse makes the end of Roman power sound like an impersonal crumbling, it misses the violence done by invaders, by rivals, by imperial factions, by commanders, gambling with provinces, and by systems of exploitation that alienate the very people expected to defend the state. Rome is not merely old when it dies in the West, it is under attack from outside and inside at once, and worse, still parts of the empire increasingly use other parts as expendable material. Imagine the empire as a vast set of landscapes rather than an abstract machine. River frontiers lined with forts and watchtowers, North African estates growing grain for distant cities, alpine passes that can carry merchants one season and armies the next, the harbours of the Mediterranean full of cargo bureaucracy and chance, villas in Gaul decorated with mosaics even as rumours from the Rhine grow darker, Syrian cities bright with trade, Spanish mines, Italian storehouses, tax offices stacked with documents, workshops forging weapons for soldiers who may never be paid on time, great urban populations dependent on supply chains so delicate that a local rebellion, a pirate fleet, or the loss of one key province can ripple outward into hunger and panic. This is not a static empire sitting proudly in marble. It is an organism spread across climates, languages, and ecologies. To destroy it, one does not need to burn every city. One only needs to damage enough arteries, enough loyalties, enough routines of obedience. Rome's own success makes it strangely vulnerable. For centuries it teaches subject peoples to admire Roman status, Roman military prestige, Roman law, Roman wealth, Roman titles. It turns outsiders into recruits, allies, rivals, clients, and would-be participants. The frontier is never a simple wall between civilization and chaos. It is a living zone of trade, migration, diplomacy, and imitation. Beyond the Rhine and Danube, many communities know Rome intimately. They have served in its armies, traded in its markets, adopted its objects, negotiated with its governors, and studied its weaknesses. The empire's enemies are rarely alien in the way older myths suggest. Many know exactly what they are attacking, and often what they seek is not the destruction of Rome in the abstract, but admission into its wealth, leverage over its resources, or authority within its system. That makes the later violence all the more destabilizing. The line between defender and destroyer grows thin. Roman generals command barbarian troops. Barbarian kings seek Roman titles. Imperial courts manipulate foreign groups against one another, then lose control of the bargain. The empire becomes a place where the language of the order survives, even as the means of enforcing order fracture. Even the famous city itself, Rome, can mislead the eye. By late antiquity, it is still vast, still symbolically unmatched in the Western imagination, yet no longer the undisputed political centre it once was. Emperors spend long stretches elsewhere, closer to frontiers, armies and crises. New capitals rise, administrative gravity shifts. That does not mean Rome is irrelevant. Quite the opposite. Its symbolic weight remains enormous. To attack Rome is to attack memory, legitimacy, and the emotional architecture of an entire civilization. But the empire's true life is now dispersed across courts, ports, military zones, and provincial tax networks. This is another reason the story of destruction is so hard to tell cleanly. The empire can be mortally wounded in places far from the Forum. A defeat in the Balkans, a lost harvest in Africa, a mutiny in Gaul, a usurpation supported by one field army. To many these may matter more than any speech delivered in the old capital. There is a lesser known and telling detail hidden in the legal and bureaucratic debris of the period. Even amid intensifying crisis, the state keeps producing paperwork. Laws proliferate. Edicts multiply. Officials complain in writing about abuses, deserters, tax arrears, runaway colony corruption, and local failures to meet imperial demands. There is something almost haunting in this. The machine keeps talking in the voice of command even while its grip weakens. The paperwork is not meaningless. It shows that structures remain alive. But it also reveals a regime responding to stress by issuing more orders into a world increasingly unable or unwilling to obey them fully. The words of empire become in places louder than its reach. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because to understand what happened to Rome, it is not enough to know that emperors changed, or that armies were defeated, or that barbarians crossed borders. It is necessary to feel the scale of what was being unmade. An empire that had outlasted generations, absorbed disasters, and repeatedly rebuilt itself, did not simply forget how to stand. It was still standing while it was being broken. That is the central tension of this story. Rome looks strongest when viewed from memory, weakest when viewed from hindsight, and most human when viewed from inside the confusion of its own final centuries. People do not wake one morning and declare that they are living through the end of the Roman world. They wake to taxes, repairs, rumours, shortages, new orders, troop movements, and another season of uncertainty. They improvise. They endure. They hope the centre still holds because for so long it always has. But this time the damage accumulates faster than recovery. The empire that mastered the Mediterranean becomes increasingly unable to protect the systems that feed and finance it. The empire that once turned enemies into subjects begins to turn subjects into fugitives and allies into predators. The empire that prided itself on law and order becomes a field of bargaining armies and brittle courts. Not in one blow, not in 1 year, and not for one reason. The destruction comes in layers, and that is why it is so easy to misunderstand. The ruins tempt later generations to imagine a clean ending. The truth is stranger, slower, and more disturbing. Rome does not vanish all at once. It is dismantled while still alive. Long before it becomes a lesson about fragility, Rome is a lesson about scale. The empire is not built in a single age by a single genius or through a single kind of conquest. It grows by improvisation, stubbornness, violence, administration, and an extraordinary talent for turning victory into structure. Roads follow armies, then merchants follow roads, then tax collectors, magistrates, surveyors, settlers, grain contractors, priests and petitioners. A captured coastline becomes a defended coastline. A defeated kingdom becomes a province. A tributary ally becomes a source of troops. What begins as the expansion of one ambitious Italian city hardens over centuries into an imperial system so large and so practical that entire generations are born into it and cannot imagine a political world organized on any other scale. That scale is the first thing to understand, because the destruction of Rome only makes sense once the immensity of what existed becomes clear. This is not merely a powerful kingdom with a few dependent territories. It is a continental order that binds together Britain's rain-soaked frontier towns, the grain fields of North Africa, the old Greek cities of the eastern Mediterranean, the river systems of Gaul, the mining districts of Spain, the deserts of Syria, the ports of Egypt, and the mountain edges of the Balkans. It contains immense differences of language, custom, landscape, climate, and memory. Yet all of this is made legible to a central authority through an apparatus of provinces, governors, taxation law, military command, and imperial communication. The distances are vast, but the empire spends centuries teaching those distances to obey. Rome's genius lies not simply in conquest, but in selective incorporation. It does not require every conquered people to become Roman in the same way or at the same speed. What it requires is order, tribute, and recognition of hierarchy. Local elites are often left in place as long as they cooperate. Cities retain pride cults and customs while entering a wider imperial framework. Aristocrats in distant provinces begin to compete for Roman favour, Roman office, Roman military distinction, and eventually Roman citizenship itself. The empire is built not only by force but by making participation desirable. A provincial notable can build a bath complex, sponsor games, fund temples, repair roads, and display loyalty in language that his grandfather might have found foreign. Within a few generations, that language can feel native. Rome becomes strongest when others begin to invest in being Roman. This is one of the great surprises of the ancient world. Rome does not rule only because it terrifies. It rules because it convinces enormous numbers of people that imperial order, however unequal, is preferable to chaos, and because it offers advancement to those willing to work within it. Roman citizenship, once tightly guarded, expands until it becomes one of the most powerful badges of belonging in the Mediterranean world. Roman law, though often harsher in practice than in theory, creates a framework through which property status, inheritance, military service, and civic obligation can be understood across regions that previously answered to very different traditions. Roman coinage circulates across seas and mountains. Roman urban forms reshape landscapes. Roman engineering pulls water into cities, bridges, rivers, drains land, and fixes movement into stone. What survives in the record suggests that many provincial communities do not merely submit to Rome, they adapt to it, profit from it, and help reproduce it. The army stands at the centre of all this, not just as an instrument of battle, but as a machine of integration. Roman soldiers build roads, fortifications, and bridges. They carry imperial presence into frontier zones where tax administration alone could never hold. Veterans settle in provinces and become transmitters of Roman habits, law, and loyalty. Auxiliary troops recruited from non-citizen populations serve the empire, and often gain citizenship through service folding distant communities more tightly into Roman structures. The army's expensive, dangerous, and politically unpredictable, but it is also one of the main reasons the empire becomes more than a map. It connects frontier survival to central authority. It makes Rome visible at the edges. Behind the army stands revenue, and behind revenue stands land. Empires do not survive on marble and rhetoric. They survive on grain rents, taxes in money, and kind labour obligations, customs duties, mine output, and predictable extraction from populations too dispersed to resist together. The Roman state develops an impressive capacity to counter-cess and demand. Census practices, land registers, tax districts, and local intermediaries all make the empire more governable than its vastness should allow. In good years, this system creates a kind of circulatory strength. Grain from Africa and Egypt supports dense urban populations. Taxes support armies. Armies secure provinces. Provinces generate wealth. Wealth funds public building and elite patronage. Cities become showcases of Roman peace, even though that peace rests everywhere on credible force. The old slogan later generations use Pax Romana can sound serene, but it's calm as iron beneath it. Roman peace means fewer rival armies marching across the same territories. It means safer seas for merchants. It means roads that remain usable because the state has an interest in maintaining them. It means disputes can be sent upward through courts and officials, instead of being settled only by kinship and retaliation. But peace also means that Rome monopolizes organized violence. Resistance, when it comes, is answered harshly. Entire communities can be crushed as examples. Rebellion is not treated as disagreement, but as a wound to imperial authority. The empire offers stability, but its stability is inseparable from coercion. That fact matters later because when the coercive system begins to fail, the peace it sustained begins to come apart with startling speed. Still, it would be a mistake to imagine this vast structure as brittle from the beginning. For centuries it proves remarkably resilient. Emperors die, are murdered, or are replaced by usurpers, yet the state continues. Frontier wars flare, but the lines hold. Plagues strike, yet taxes are still levied, officials still appointed, and armies still raised. This resilience is part of the story's tragedy. Rome survives so much for so long that it trains both rulers and subjects to expect recovery. Disaster becomes familiar but not terminal. One bad emperor is followed by another settlement. One rebellion is suppressed, one frontier restored, one mint reformed, one harvest replaced by imports. The empire learns to live in permanent repair. That habit of survival becomes almost a psychological resource. It also becomes a dangerous illusion. There is lesser-known detail buried in the geography of Roman endurance. The empire's roads and sea lanes do not merely move legions and luxury goods. They move information at a speed unusual for the ancient world. Orders, petitions, tax records, military intelligence, and private correspondence travel through a dense web of routes maintained by public effort and private necessity. An emperor far away can still intervene in provincial affairs because systems exist to carry instruction and response. This does not make the empire omniscient. Delays remain, long corruption remains common, and local realities often outpace central command. But it does create something rare, a political world in which distant regions are accustomed to looking toward a shared centre for judgment. That habit of deference is one of Rome's greatest achievements. It is also one of the hardest things to preserve once confidence in the centre begins to erode, and confidence matters almost as much as military force. Rome rules because people believe Rome can punish, protect, and endure. A frontier commander holds because the enemy fears reinforcement. A city pays because it expects the tax system to continue. A merchant risks cargo because sea routes are patrolled often enough to make trade worthwhile. A provincial aristocrat remains loyal because imperial service still promises honour and advancement. Remove confidence and each of these calculations changes. Obedience becomes negotiation. Service becomes opportunism. Local self-protection begins to outrank imperial solidarity. The machine still exists, but its parts no longer trust the whole. That is why the Empire's greatness cannot be measured only in conquest. Its real achievement is duration through organization. Rome creates habits of dependence across continents. Cities rely on imperial peace. Elites rely on imperial office. Soldiers rely on imperial pay. The poor rely in some places on imperial grain. Bishops, landowners, merchants, contractors, judges, scribes, and sailors all learn to work within a framework larger than their own town, tribe, or kingdom. By the time the empire reaches its mature form, it is not simply a ruler over territories. It is the environment in which public life takes place. And that is precisely what makes its destruction so consequential. To bring down Rome in the West is not merely to unseat an emperor or lose a battle. It is to tear apart an organizing world. The roads remain, but fewer can secure them. The cities remain, but some begin to thin, shrink, or harden behind walls. The laws remain, but enforcement becomes uneven. The titles remain, but authority leaks out of them. The empire has become so large, so normal, so deeply woven into ordinary expectation that its weakening is at first almost impossible to see clearly. Yet once such a system starts to fail, everything connected to it begins to feel strain. Rome is powerful enough to rule continents. It is organized enough to survive generations of crisis. It is admired enough that even many enemies want its recognition rather than its annihilation. All of this makes the coming centuries more, not less revealing. Because what is destroyed is not some exhausted shell waiting to be tipped into dust. What is destroyed is one of the most durable political orders humanity had yet built. The first great warning comes long before the famous endings. It arrives not as a final blow, but as a season of shock so relentless that the empire seems for a time to be coming apart in every direction at once. Emperors rise and vanish with alarming speed. Armies proclaim their own commanders. Frontiers split open under pressure. Coinage loses trust. Disease moves through crowded settlements and military routes. Regions begin to think first of local survival and only second of imperial unity. If later generations want a single moment when Rome should have died, they often look here to the 3rd century because this is when the empire appears closest to genuine collapse. And yet, it does not die. That fact matters more than it first seems because the crises of this period show both how much punishment Rome can absorb and how deeply it must change in order to keep living. From a distance, the 3rd century empire still looks enormous. The old roads remain. Cities continue to function. Taxes are still collected. Orders still travel outward from the centre. But beneath that surface, continuity is becoming expensive. The old imperial model depends on a dangerous balancing act. Armies must be strong enough to hold the frontiers, but not so powerful that their loyalty to a commander turns into a bid for the throne. Emperors must reward soldiers without bankrupting the state. Provincial elites must remain cooperative even as taxation grows heavier. Trade must continue even when war and raids make transport riskier. When several of these pressures intensify at once, the empire begins to shake, not at the margins only, but in the core of its political logic. Much of the trouble comes from the throne itself. The Roman Empire has never solved the problem of succession elegantly. Adoption, heredity, military acclaim, senatorial approval, dynastic marriage, and outright force all coexist as possible roads to supreme power. That ambiguity is survivable in stable periods, but in times of stress it becomes lethal. The army, which is supposed to defend the state, increasingly becomes the arena in which the state is gambled away. A successful general gains prestige. Prestige invites loyalty. Loyalty invites proclamation. Proclamation invites civil war. An emperor who fears a general may recall him, undermine him, or eliminate him. A general who fears being eliminated may move first. The result is a carousel of rulers, claimants, assassinations, and campaigns in which Roman soldiers kill Roman soldiers, while enemies beyond the frontiers watch carefully and learn. This is one of the most destructive habits the empire ever acquires. It spends military strength internally while telling itself it is preserving order. There is grim understatement in the bureaucratic language of stability when the real instrument of government has become repeated crisis management through force. Provinces that should be defended become bargaining chips in contest for legitimacy. Troops that should guard the Rhine or Danube are marched elsewhere to settle a dispute over who wears purple. No single explanation fully accounts for the damage done by these struggles, but their cumulative effect is unmistakable. Every civil war tells the frontiers that the empire is distracted. Every usurpation encourages regional commanders to think of imperial power as negotiable. At the same time, Rome faces enemies who are no longer merely scattered raiders testing the edges. On the eastern frontier, a more aggressive Persian state emerges under the Sasanian dynasty, ambitious, organized, and eager to challenge Rome as an equal rather than a nuisance. In the north and northwest, confederated groups along the Rhine and Danube become more formidable and more flexible than older Roman stereotypes suggest. These are not faceless waves in the simplistic way later myth likes to imagine them. They are shifting coalitions with leaders, ambitions, internal politics, and a keen sense of opportunity. They do not need to conquer the empire outright to wound it. Raids, penetrations, sieges, and the disruption of provincial life are enough to expose how thin Roman security can become when central authority is contested. Then disease arrives or perhaps intensifies what war and instability have already begun. Scholars still debate the precise nature and demographic scale of the so-called plague of Cyprian, just as they debate parts of the earlier Antonine plague, because the evidence remains incomplete and ancient descriptions are frustratingly imprecise. But what survives in the record suggests a world in which epidemic illness compounds every other weakness. Armies are harder to replenish. Rural labour becomes less reliable. Tax burdens fall on fewer shoulders. Fear magnifies rumour, and rumour magnifies despair. Bishops, chroniclers, and officials write in tones that suggest not only grief, but disorientation. The empire has always expected war. Disease on this scale is harder to negotiate with. It empties households, weakens institutions, and reminds everyone that imperial power has limits even within its own walls. Money, meanwhile, becomes both a tool of emergency and a symptom of distress. To pay soldiers and sustain government emperors debase coinage stretching silver farther than confidence can bear. The practical consequences are uneven and regionally varied, but the broad pattern is clear enough: inflation, distrust, price instability, and a sense that the old financial language of empire is becoming harder to believe. A coin is not just metal. It is a promise stamped with authority. When that promise weakens, the damage is economic and psychological at once. Merchants adjust. Tax demands become harsher or more confused. Soldiers want compensation that keeps pace with reality. Rural producers try to shield themselves. The state, desperate to remain solvent and militarily credible, presses harder. That pressure does not restore the old balance. It alters society in more coercive directions. For a time, the empire even seems to split beyond repair. In the west, a breakaway Gallic empire forms encompassing Gaul Britain and parts of Spain under its own emperors. In the east, the wealthy city of Palmyra rises under Odenathus, and later Zenobia, into a semi-independent power that dominates crucial eastern territories. This is one of the most startling details of the period, and one that is often underappreciated. Rome is not merely invaded. it is politically duplicated. Rival Romanities emerge, each claiming order in place of weakness. The centre does not simply lose control, it is imitated by regional structures that suggest imperial authority can be reproduced elsewhere when the original source falters. That is a dangerous revelation. Once provinces begin to function under alternative centres even temporarily, the magic of indivisible empire is broken, and still Rome survives. That survival should not be mistaken for smooth recovery. It is a bruised, improvised, often brutal survival. Emperors like Claudius II Aurelian and later Diocletian do not restore an old golden age. They force the empire back into coherence by war reform and relentless centralization. Aurelian in particular becomes a figure of almost desperate energy, defeating enemies, reuniting splinter states, and reminding the Roman world that the empire can still strike back. The construction of stronger walls around Rome itself under Aurelian is especially revealing. The capital that once projected untroubled confidence now visibly prepares for danger. Stone becomes an admission that even symbols need protection. These years teach Roman rulers a hard lesson. The earlier empire, with its lighter administrative touch and its confidence in traditional civic elites, is no longer enough. If Rome is to endure, it must become more heavily organized, more militarized, more bureaucratic, and more intrusive. The price of survival is transformation. Diocletian's later reforms grow directly from this realization. Administration is expanded, provinces are subdivided, taxation is made more systematic, the army is reorganized, imperial display becomes more formal and distant. Rule becomes less the easy theatrical primacy of a first citizen, and more the guarded authority of a sacral monarch presiding over a machine too large and too stressed to run on old habits alone. There is an irony here that sits at the heart of the larger story. The crisis of the 3rd century proves that Rome is not fragile in any simple sense. A weaker state would have disappeared. Rome instead absorbs civil war plague, invasion, fragmentation, financial distortion, and political chaos then reasserts itself. But the form in which it survives is changed. The empire that emerges is tougher in some ways, less flexible in others, more commanding, more suspicious, and more dependent on constant mobilization. It does not so much heal as scar over. The state becomes more capable of extracting resources, but often at greater social cost. It becomes more resilient in the face of immediate emergencies, but also more brittle when trust between rulers, elites, soldiers, and subjects begins to thin. What this means for the future is profound. Rome has now learned that it can survive almost anything except the loss of organized power, so it organizes more. It concentrates authority, multiplies offices, watches frontiers with sharper anxiety, and binds populations more tightly to tax and service obligations. In the short term, this works. The empire does not collapse in the 3rd century. It is refashioned. The roads still run. The laws still issue forth, the army still move, the imperial title still commands awe. But the cost of preserving Rome has become part of the danger facing Rome. A state built to endure crisis may also become a state that exhausts the loyalties it needs in order to endure. That is why this century matters so much. It is not the end. It is the rehearsal, the warning, and the turning point before the turning point. Rome passes through fire and remains standing, but no longer in quite the same way. It has survived a storm fierce enough to kill lesser powers. Yet survival has not removed the underlying problems. It has taught the empire new habits of force, new forms of dependence on the army, new fiscal burdens, and new reasons to fear fragmentation. The world will look more stable afterward. In some places it will even feel renewed. But beneath that renewed surface lies an altered empire, one that has already discovered how close it can come to destruction and how expensive it is to pull itself back. The empire that comes out of the 3rd century crisis is still Roman, but it is Roman in a harder, colder way. The old image of imperial rule, in which a ruler at least pretends to be first among citizens, becomes less convincing in a world where every frontier may erupt and every general may dream of the throne. Survival now demands distance, ceremony, redundancy, and control. Emperors no longer trust a single centre to command a world so large. They no longer trust one court, one chain of communication, or one military concentration to respond fast enough to danger. The answer is not surrender, it is division for the sake of preservation. This is one of the most important changes in the history of Rome and one of the easiest to misunderstand. The empire is not split because it is already dead. It is divided because it is still alive and trying to stay that way. Diocletian, who rises from the army in the late 3rd century, sees clearly that the empire's size is now one of its greatest strategic problems. A ruler cannot be everywhere, yet trouble can begin almost anywhere on the Rhine, in Egypt, in Syria, in the Balkans, in Britain, in the court itself. Delayed response invites rebellion or invasion, so the imperial office multiplies. Senior emperors and junior colleagues are arranged into a system later called the tetrarchy, a rule of 4 meant to provide presence where a single sovereign body no longer can. It is a striking admission disguised as reform. The empire has become too large, too tense, and too exposed to be governed effectively from one city by one man relying on one network of loyalty. The solution is administrative rather than sentimental. Rome remains one empire in law and theory, but in practice it now depends on several centres of command. The cities associated with rule begin to shift accordingly. Rome itself still matters immensely as a symbol, but emperors spend more time in places nearer the frontiers and the armies that secure them. Melantria, Sirmium, Nicomedia. These become working capitals of a mobile and militarized empire. This is not a rejection of Rome so much as a recognition that prestige does not stop invasions. Government must stand where the problems are. A court near the Rhine can respond more quickly to northern threats than one deep in Italy. An emperor in the east can better manage Persian pressure tax flows and the complex politics of the eastern provinces. Administrative geography changes because strategic geography demands it. For a time, the new system works impressively well. Scholars still debate how stable the arrangement ever truly was because it rests on personal loyalty and succession discipline that no Roman system had ever fully mastered. Even so, its practical advantages are obvious. Multiple emperors can campaign in different theatres at once. Usurpation becomes harder when imperial presence is more distributed. Provinces feel the court closer at hand. The empire looks less like a giant body trying to move with one overstrained head, and more like a network of coordinated organs. Diocletian's broader reforms deepen this effect. Provinces are subdivided so that no governor commands too much territory or too many troops. Layers of dioceses and prefectures are imposed to improve oversight. Taxation is assessed more systematically. Military and civil authority are increasingly distinguished. The state becomes more legible to itself, and therefore more capable of intervening, yet every gain comes with a price. More administration means more officials. More officials mean more expense, more paperwork, more room for corruption, and more demands placed on local communities expected to sustain the machine. The empire is learning to survive by becoming denser, and density is not the same as health. What survives in the record suggests a state ever more concerned with fixing people to obligations, taxpayers to land workers, to professions, communities to quotas, elites to service. These measures are not the cartoon of total control they are sometimes made out to be. but they reveal a government increasingly anxious about slippage. If soldiers desert, if tax rolls shrink, if producers flee, if local notables evade duty, the whole structure suffers. Rome responds by binding more tightly. That may stabilize the system in the short term, but it also risks turning subjects into reluctant participants rather than invested partners. The military reforms are equally revealing. Frontier defense remains vital, but the empire increasingly relies on a more layered arrangement. Troops stationed along borders, mobile field armies held back for rapid response, and a more flexible distribution of force than the older model of linear defense alone. This is a rational answer to a changing world. Enemies do not always come as simple frontal assaults. Raids penetrate. Usurpers appear in the interior. Reinforcement must be able to move. But the separation between frontier forces and mobile imperial armies creates new tensions. Border troops may feel exposed or undervalued. Field armies closer to imperial courts and succession struggles become politically sensitive. The same reforms that make Rome more adaptable also make it more dependent on maintaining coordination between dispersed military layers. When coordination fails, the very complexity designed to save the empire can work against it. Then comes Constantine, and with him another decisive shift. His rise out of the post-tetrarchic struggles proves that even Diocletian's careful architecture cannot solve Rome's old problem of power without personal rivalry. Civil war returns. Claimants maneuver, armies choose sides, and once again the empire's own defenders consume one another in contests over legitimacy. Constantine wins, and his victory reshapes the empire in lasting ways. He founds or refounds Constantinople on the site of Byzantium, a city perfectly positioned to command routes between Europe and Asia, near enough to crucial frontiers and trade arteries to function as an Eastern imperial centre of extraordinary strength. This move is sometimes treated as if Rome is abandoned overnight. It is not. The old capital remains loaded with memory and prestige, but the balance of gravity is changing unmistakably. The East, wealthier, more urbanized in many regions, and strategically central to several of the empire's most vital concerns, now has a capital fitted to its importance. Constantine's religious policies also alter imperial culture, though not in the simplistic way older polemic once imagined. Christianity's growing imperial favour does not cause the empire's later destruction in any straightforward sense. That idea is too crude and unsupported. But it does change networks of loyalty, patronage, and public authority. Bishops gain increasing prominence. Church institutions begin to intersect with imperial governance in new ways. Sacred legitimacy becomes more visibly tied to the ruler. Disputes once marginal to state power now draw imperial intervention. None of this weakens the empire by itself. In some ways it provides fresh cohesion, yet it also means the empire is becoming different from the civic aristocratic temple-studded order of earlier centuries. The Roman world is not standing still while it tries to preserve itself. It is transforming culturally as well as administratively and militarily. This is where the question of division becomes more subtle. The empire is still in principle one. Laws issued in one part matter in another. Emperors recognize each other within a broader Roman framework, at least when politics allow. The fiction, or perhaps the aspiration of unity, remains powerful. But practical life increasingly separates East from West. They face different strategic environments. They have different revenue strengths. Their urban networks are not identical. Their courts cultivate different interests and habits. Resources can still flow across the whole, yet political attention is never perfectly even. When one half is in crisis, the other may help, but not always enough, not always willingly, and not always in time. This matters later because the Western Empire's destruction will unfold under the shadow of an Eastern partner that survives, watches, intervenes selectively, and proves that Rome as an idea outlives the ruin of Rome in the West. A lesser-known but deeply revealing detail from this reorganized empire is the way official ceremony thickens around the emperor. Access becomes more controlled. Dress, audience, and etiquette become more elaborate. The ruler is more distant, more sacral, more enclosed within court ritual. Part of this is political theatre designed to enhance obedience. Part of it is practical security in an age of conspiracy and military menace. But part of it also tells a larger story. The empire no longer expects loyalty to flow naturally from shared civic identity and old republican memory. It must be staged, protected, and magnified. Authority is becoming something that must be displayed at greater intensity precisely because it can no longer be assumed. And yet, for all these changes, the empire does not look doomed. That is the essential point. It looks recovered. Borders are guarded. Administration is functioning. Coinage is stabilized. Courts are active. Great cities still flourish. Imperial building continues. The machinery of Roman government remains immensely impressive. This is why later destruction is so often misunderstood. People imagine a steady downward slope, but the reality is more jagged. The empire solves immediate dangers through reform, and in doing so it creates a more durable state than the one that nearly broke in the 3rd century. But that durability is uneven. The East benefits more from structural strengths of wealth, urban concentration, and defensible depth. The West, though still formidable, becomes more exposed to the costs of prolonged military disruption and fiscal loss. The division meant to save the empire does save it in a sense. It gives Rome more flexibility, more centres of command, and a better chance to survive regional shocks. Without these reforms, the empire might well have perished much earlier, but division also changes the meaning of Roman unity. It trains rulers and subjects alike to think regionally within an imperial frame. It creates courts that can disagree, delay, compete, and prioritize differently. It makes survival possible while also making asymmetry harder to ignore. When the great crises of the 4th and 5th centuries begin to gather, the empire will still call itself one body. But one arm will prove stronger than the other, and the weaker arm will discover that sharing a name is not always the same as sharing rescue. That is the paradox at the heart of this new Roman order. The empire divides because it intends to endure. It survives because it adapts. Yet every adaptation leaves traces, and not all of them are strengths. More capitals mean more resilience, but also more distance. More armies mean more flexibility, but also more expense and more political risk. More bureaucracy means more control, but also more burden. Rome is preserving itself through transformation, and transformation always changes what exactly is being preserved. By the late 4th century, the Roman frontier no longer feels like a clean edge. On maps and in imperial law, it still appears as a line: the Rhine, the Danube, the fortified roads, the river stations, the watchtowers, the commanders with their districts and their ranks. But frontiers are never only lines. They are zones of contact, compromise, fear, and appetite. Traders cross them. Envoys negotiate across them. Deserters slip through them. Young men beyond them imagine Roman pay and Roman equipment. Ambitious leaders beyond them imagine Roman titles, subsidies, and the political advantage of being recognized by the empire they may one day threaten. For centuries, Rome has managed this unstable world with a mixture of force and diplomacy, absorbing some groups, intimidating others, recruiting many, dividing enemies against one another whenever possible. The system is dangerous, but familiar. What begins to change now is the scale of pressure and the speed with which local instability can turn into imperial crisis. The old image of barbarian peoples as endless anonymous masses pressing blindly against civilization is too crude to be useful. What stands beyond Rome's borders is not simple chaos, but a shifting mosaic of communities with their own leaders, rivalries, trade ties, and survival strategies. Goths, Franks, Alemanni Vandals, Suebi Burgundians, Huns and many others are not static nations in the later sense, nor are they mere bands without memory or structure. They are political societies adapting to a world in which Rome remains both an overwhelming neighbour and an irresistible source of wealth. Some serve Rome, some raid it, some negotiate with it for land payments or military service, some do all three within a generation. The frontier trembles not because outsiders suddenly discover Rome, but because Rome can no longer control the terms of contact as fully as before. A great deal depends on geography. The Rhine and Danube are formidable barriers only when backed by organised surveillance, timely reinforcement and reliable command. Rivers help defence, but they do not defend themselves. A watchtower unmanned a garrison, unpaid a commander distracted by court politics or troops withdrawn for civil war, can turn a frontier from shield to invitation. This is the hidden fragility of Rome's border system. It looks solid in stone and law. In practice, it is a living arrangement sustained by money, trust, transport, and discipline. Remove enough of those and the line phrase. Even before the most famous disasters, there are signs everywhere that the edges of empire are becoming harder to police. Raids penetrate farther. Negotiated settlements grow more precarious. Roman commanders rely more heavily on diplomacy because force alone is expensive and stretched thin. Then another force appears behind the frontier peoples and changes the pressure altogether. The Huns moving westward out of the Eurasian steppe do not destroy Rome directly at first. Their impact is more indirect and in some ways more destabilizing. They strike or intimidate groups beyond Rome's borders, disrupting existing balances and triggering movement among peoples who would otherwise have remained where they were or moved more slowly. Scholars still debate the exact sequence and scale of these chain reactions because the evidence remains incomplete, and later narratives sometimes simplify what must have been a messy human reality. But what survives in the record suggests something unmistakable. The world beyond the Danube is becoming more violent, less predictable, and harder for Rome to manage through ordinary frontier methods. The most dramatic test comes with the Goths in the 370s. Pressed by Hunnic violence and seeking refuge, large Gothic groups gather at the Danube and ask to enter imperial territory. In theory, this is not unprecedented. Rome has long admitted outsiders under controlled conditions, settling them, recruiting them, extracting military value from them, and turning potential enemies into dependent populations. There is a logic to it. The empire needs manpower. The newcomers need safety. Done properly, such settlement can strengthen Rome. But the phrase "done properly" hides everything that matters. Administration, supply, honesty, and discipline are required at exactly the moment when local officials are often corrupt, overloaded, or frightened. What happens next is one of the clearest examples of Rome helping to create its own catastrophe. The Gothic refugees are permitted across, but the process is badly managed from the start. They are not settled smoothly into a stable system of food distribution and oversight. They are exploited. Some Roman officials, if the sources can be trusted, even partly extort and abuse them in ways so petty and cruel that the story becomes almost surreal in its squalor. Families are starved, cheated, and humiliated, while armed men remain concentrated and desperate inside imperial territory. This is not merely administrative failure. It is the transformation of a manageable challenge into a military threat through greed and incompetence. Rome has invited in a distressed population and then treated it as prey, That detail matters because it reveals a pattern that will recur again and again. The Empire does not simply face external pressure, it repeatedly magnifies danger by mishandling those who enter its orbit. Groups that might have become taxpayers, soldiers, or dependent allies instead become enraged enemies. Local commanders pursue short-term advantage while ignoring long-term consequences. Court politics delay coherent response. The result is that the frontier stops behaving like a threshold controlled by Rome and starts behaving like a wound through which unstable populations, imperial weakness, and opportunistic violence all pass together. As Gothic unrest turns to open conflict, the Roman state discovers that its assumptions about superiority no longer guarantee results. Imperial armies can still be formidable, but they are not invincible, and fragmented command makes them less so. There is also a psychological problem now. For generations, Rome has expected that violence beyond the frontier can be managed by intimidation, selective settlement, and punitive force. But the groups gathering near and within the empire are changing in scale and cohesion, while Rome's own capacity for swift concentration of force has become more uncertain. The frontier trembles because both sides are adapting, and one side has less margin for error than before. At the same time, the frontier system itself has grown more blurred. Roman armies include increasing numbers of men of non-Roman provincial background and of frontier origin. Some rise high, some become indispensable. The distinction between Roman and barbarian, always less absolute in practice than rhetoric suggested, becomes harder to maintain cleanly. That is not in itself a sign of decline. Rome has always incorporated outsiders, but in an age of court intrigue and military faction, it contributes to a new instability. A leader beyond the frontier may have served Rome. A commander inside Rome may depend on followers whose loyalties are personal, not civic. A settled group inside the empire may be both protector and latent threat. The frontier no longer sits at the edge. In many ways, it has moved inward. There is a quieter consequence too often overshadowed by battles. Frontier insecurity changes the calculations of ordinary people. Landowners fortify estates, cities repair or raise walls, peasants flee exposed districts, traders factor danger into routes and prices. Tax collection becomes harder in devastated zones, which in turn weakens military funding, which further weakens defense. A single successful penetration can do more than kill. It can unravel confidence, and confidence as ever in Roman history is one of the empire's most valuable invisible assets. Once populations begin to suspect that the state cannot reliably shield them, localism grows. Private protection becomes more attractive. Imperial solidarity becomes a noble phrase with less daily meaning. The West is especially vulnerable to this spiral. Its resources are still significant, but they are less concentrated than in the East, and its ability to move surplus rapidly into threatened zones is more limited. Italy remains symbolically central, but the Western Empire depends heavily on provinces that are difficult to defend simultaneously when frontier crises multiply. Gaul matters for manpower and strategic depth. Spain contributes wealth and stability when secure. North Africa is vital for grain and revenue. Lose control of the frontier long enough, and pressure does not stay at the frontier. It radiates inward through these interdependent regions. That is what makes the trembling of the borders so ominous. It is not a local problem, it is the early movement of a structural failure. A lesser-known but telling clue appears in the growing importance of negotiated barbarian settlements under imperial authority. These arrangements, often practical and sometimes unavoidable, reveal how much Rome now relies on managing force it does not fully command. Settled groups may provide troops guard regions or support a claimant, but every such agreement carries risk. If payment fails, if trust collapses, if local populations resist, or if a rival court intervenes, the settlement becomes not a solution, but another centre of armed bargaining. Rome is no longer merely defeating enemies at its edges, it is increasingly housing potential power blocks inside the imperial frame. This is the frontier at the moment it starts to change character. It still has forts, it still has officers, it still has legal language and military tradition, yet it is losing the clarity that once made the empire feel unassailable. Pressure builds from beyond, but also from misrule within. New peoples do not simply appear like a storm from nowhere. They move through landscapes already destabilized by imperial overextension, local exploitation, court competition, and the growing difficulty of matching resources to danger. The line trembles because the empire itself is trembling. Soon the consequences will become unmistakable, but already the pattern is there in full. Rome's border system depends on discipline, provisioning, and credible power. When frightened populations arrive, it must either absorb them competently or confront them decisively. It does neither consistently. The frontier that once filtered danger now begins to admit it in armed and organized form, not because Rome has suddenly ceased to exist, but because it remains large enough to attract desperate peoples and no longer coherent enough to process them safely. That is how a shield becomes a fracture line. Once large groups from beyond the frontier begin entering Roman territory in serious numbers, the empire is forced into a test it has faced before, but never under conditions quite like these. Rome has long absorbed outsiders. That much is true, and it is important to say clearly because later myths too often imagine an empire suddenly overwhelmed by foreigners it neither understood nor had ever dealt with. In reality, Rome has centuries of experience settling captured populations, granting land under conditions, recruiting non-Roman soldiers, and transforming potential enemies into taxpayers or troops. The empire's strength has often rested on exactly this ability to turn strangers into components of Roman order. But systems that work in stable times can fail catastrophically in unstable ones, and by the late 4th century the difference between incorporation and disintegration is becoming frighteningly thin. The newcomers do not enter an empire at peace with itself. They enter a world of strained logistics, suspicious commanders, overburdened officials, and regional populations already anxious about taxation and security. They enter a state that still speaks the language of absolute authority, but increasingly struggles to enforce that authority evenly. This is the hidden drama behind the movement of Goths and later other groups into imperial territory. The story is not simply that outsiders cross a border. The story is that Rome receives them while lacking the administrative calm, military concentration, and political trust needed to convert their arrival into something manageable. The result is not immediate annihilation. It is something more dangerous, unstable coexistence inside the empire's own body. The Goths who enter after the Danube crisis are not a handful of scattered refugees. They are armed communities with leaders, families, wagons, expectations, fears, and memories of Roman promises. Many likely imagine that life inside the empire, however hard, will still be safer than life under Hunnic pressure beyond it. Rome, for its part, sees potential manpower and a chance to channel migration into service. There is a cold logic in that calculation. The empire constantly needs soldiers. Settled barbarian groups can, under the right arrangements, provide them. But the right arrangements are everything. Food has to be delivered. Locations have to be chosen. Command structures have to be monitored. Local populations have to be protected from panic, and the newcomers have to be protected from predation by Roman officials who see desperation as an opportunity for profit. What survives in the record suggests those conditions are badly absent. Exploitation turns danger into rage. Starvation turns dependence into desperation. Distrust turns every Roman order into a possible trap. When Gothic groups begin to resist, the empire no longer faces a passive migrant population. It faces armed people already inside its territory, moving through regions whose defenders are uncertain, divided, or late to respond. This is one of the most consequential changes in the whole story. A frontier enemy can be watched, delayed, negotiated with, or confronted at the border. An enemy formed by failed incorporation is already past the gate. Rome has not simply admitted pressure, it has internalized it. There is a tendency in older narratives to blame this moment on barbarian savagery alone, as though violence erupts from some inherent inability of outsiders to live within civilization. That is much too simple, and it lets the empire off too easily. Roman greed and incompetence help produce the disaster. So does the empire's habit of treating human communities as movable resource pools rather than fragile populations with their own internal cohesion and limits. The Gothic crisis exposes a harsh truth. Rome is very good at commanding obedience when its systems function. It is much less good at repairing trust once those systems reveal their cruelty. The empire has always ruled through hierarchy, but hierarchy under stress becomes abuse, and abuse becomes rebellion. At the same time, the Western and Eastern courts begin to reveal another weakness. They do not always respond to crisis as parts of one organism. They bargain, delay, prioritize, and calculate. The empire still proclaims unity, but practical attention is fragmented. This matters enormously for groups now settled or moving within Roman space. A people may become the problem of one court more than another, one region, more than another, one commander more than another. Responsibility diffuses just when concentration is needed. Military force too is not infinitely available. Troops are expensive, and the empire's own recent habits of civil conflict mean that rulers are often wary of empowering any single commander too much. Even when danger is obvious, response is shaped by fear of internal rivals as much as by fear of the enemy. The result is a new kind of politics inside the empire. Gothic leaders negotiate, threaten, maneuver, and survive not as distant raiders, but as armed actors within Roman territory. They can exploit rivalries among Roman authorities. They can use movement itself as leverage. They can feed followers through plunder when supply fails, and plunder in turn deepens Roman panic. Cities shut gates. Villas are abandoned. Local communities wonder whether the empire's promise of order still means anything. The frontier problem has become a provincial problem, an agricultural problem, a fiscal problem, and above all a confidence problem. Once fear enters the interior, the empire's scale begins to work against it. The territories are too vast, the needs too many, the loyalties too uneven for easy recovery. There is also a cultural dislocation that should not be underestimated. Roman identity has always been broad enough to absorb outsiders, but it still depends on a hierarchy in which Rome sets terms. When armed groups inside the empire begin forcing new terms through negotiation or violence, the symbolic order weakens along with the military one. Roman elites can accept barbarian soldiers in Roman service. They can accept barbarian officers under Roman authority. What is far harder to accept is the spectacle of barbarian leaders dealing with the empire almost as equals, while imperial officials scramble to contain the consequences. The old assumption that Rome defines the relationship is slipping away. That loss of symbolic control matters because empires rule partly through imagination. People obey not only force but the idea of rightful superiority. Once that idea is publicly shaken, every compromise looks like weakness. The settlements that follow are therefore unstable by nature. Groups are planted in certain regions, enlisted under agreements expected to provide military service or local defense, and sometimes left under their own leaders, in ways that blur the boundary between imperial subject and semi-autonomous power. Scholars still debate how coherent these arrangements always were in practice, because legal formulas and lived realities rarely match neatly. But the broader pattern is unmistakable. Rome is increasingly managing organized outsiders through negotiated dependence rather than direct absorption. Sometimes this works for a while, sometimes it buys desperately needed peace. Yet every such arrangement carries a future risk. A settled group may turn against the empire if promises are broken, if rival leaders compete, if Roman commanders provoke them, or if the state simply lacks the strength to supervise what it has created. This is why the old phrase "barbarians at the gates" becomes misleading. By now many are no longer at the gates. They are in the provinces, in the army, in the networks of patronage and command, sometimes loyal, sometimes opportunistic, sometimes both within the same lifetime. The empire is not being surrounded in a simple military sense. It is being penetrated, bargained with, and internally rearranged. Roman authority still exists, but it increasingly shares space with armed power it does not wholly control. That is a much more dangerous condition than open war at a border, because it corrodes the distinction between obedience and alliance. When the empire commands, is it being obeyed, or merely accommodated temporarily by forces waiting for a better offer? A lesser-known but revealing aspect of this period is how often ordinary provincial populations bear the cost of these high-level failures. When negotiated groups are settled, local landholders may lose property or income. When armies move to contain unrest, rural districts are stripped for supplies. When plunder begins, peasants and townspeople suffer first. The literary sources often focus on emperors and generals, but the deeper damage spreads through villages, estates, markets, and roads. Agricultural rhythms are broken. Taxes continue to be demanded even where the land has been ravaged. Refugees move. Local self-defense grows more attractive. In some places, Roman rule begins to feel less like protection than like an additional burden layered on top of insecurity. That is a subtle but decisive change. An empire can survive hatred at its edges longer than indifference or resentment in its own interior. What makes all this so consequential is that Rome still remains strong enough to imagine recovery. It has faced crises before. It has settled peoples before. It has used barbarian manpower before. None of this taken alone guarantees destruction. No single explanation fully accounts for what is unfolding. But the pattern is worsening. Each failed settlement creates another armed grievance. Each emergency bargain creates another precedent for autonomy. Each mismanaged migration teaches both outsiders and insiders that Rome's promises are uncertain and its discipline incomplete. The empire's traditional talent for incorporation has not vanished, but it is now operating under levels of pressure and mistrust that turn success into a narrower possibility. By the time the Gothic problem matures into open war, the deeper transformation is already underway. Rome is no longer simply defending borders against external peoples. It is struggling to govern populations it has admitted mistreated and then failed to master. That is a different kind of danger, one created as much by the empire's own breakdown in competence as by the strength of its enemies. Outsiders have entered Rome before and become Roman. Now outsiders enter Rome and become something else, organized reminders that the imperial machine can no longer digest everything it takes in. The consequences will soon be measured in battlefields and imperial deaths, but the real turning point begins here in the moment when Roman power stops shaping entry on its own terms. Once that happens, the empire is no longer merely facing pressure from beyond. It is carrying that pressure within itself, feeding it through misrule, and teaching it how to survive inside the Roman world. The battle comes in heat and confusion under a late summer sky in 378 somewhere near Adrianople in Thrace, where the Empire's confidence finally runs into a reality it can no longer dismiss. Roman armies have lost before. Emperors have died before. Frontier wars have gone badly before. None of that is new. What makes Adrianople so haunting is not simply the scale of defeat, though that is terrible enough, nor even the death of an emperor on the field, though that sends a shock through the Roman world that is hard to overstate. What makes it haunting is the feeling visible even through the distortions of later memory that an illusion has been broken. The empire that still speaks in the voice of command discovers that command is no longer enough. Valen's emperor in the east marches toward confrontation with Gothic forces already inside imperial territory after years of mismanagement, violence, negotiation, and failed control. Reinforcements from the Western Emperor Gratian may be on the way or near enough to matter. Councils available to wait, but imperial politics has its own momentum and battlefield decisions are rarely made in a calm vacuum. Glory matters. Timing matters. The fear that another ruler may share or steal the victory matters. The army moves toward battle carrying not only weapons, but all the anxieties and calculations of a system that has become dangerously dependent on personal prestige. Scholars still debate the exact details of the engagement, the strength of the forces involved, and the reliability of the surviving accounts, because the evidence remains incomplete, and ancient narrators often prefer moral lessons to tactical clarity. But the broad shape is clear enough. Valen's attacks before the Western reinforcements fully join him, and the result is disaster. The Roman army that arrives near the Gothic wagon lager is already under strain. The day is hot, the march exhausting, the terrain imperfectly understood. Negotiations flicker uncertainly. Fighting begins before order is fully secured, and then the Gothic cavalry, absent or underestimated at a critical moment, returns with devastating effect. Roman formations are struck, compressed, confused and broken. Units cannot maneuver properly. Dust, heat and overcrowding turn discipline into suffocation. Men die not only by enemy blows but by panic and collapse inside their own packed lines. A Roman army, supposedly the most formidable instrument of order in the known world, is reduced to chaos in a single burning afternoon. Valens disappears into that chaos. His body is never securely recovered. Later stories place him wounded, perhaps taken to a farmhouse, perhaps burned inside it as Gothic attackers close in. The details remain uncertain, and uncertainty itself adds something grim to the episode. The Emperor of the East Lord of Armies and Provinces vanishes into rumour smoke and contested memory. For a Roman ruler, this is almost symbolically perfect in its ugliness. There is no triumphant funeral procession, no staged final dignity, only the disappearance of imperial command into battlefield confusion. The empire does not simply lose men, it loses the image of mastery. Later generations often treat Adrianople as the battle that doomed Rome. That claim is too simple. No single explanation fully accounts for the destruction of the Western Empire, and no single battle, however catastrophic, can carry all the weight of what follows. The Eastern Empire itself survives Adrianople. It regroups, negotiates, rebuilds, and continues for centuries. Even in the West, Roman institutions do not instantly unravel because of one defeat in Thrace. The empire has endured terrible shocks before, yet it would be equally mistaken to minimize Adrianople into just another lost battle. Its significance lies less in immediate annihilation than in revelation. The battle exposes the cost of mismanaging barbarian settlement, the danger of divided imperial coordination, the risks of overconfident leadership, and the unsettling fact that large organized groups inside Roman territory can now destroy imperial field armies under the right conditions. This is the broken illusion at the heart of Adrianople. For centuries, Rome has treated military defeat as something that can be contained by deeper reserves of organization. A legion lost can be replaced. A frontier breach can be repaired. A campaign gone wrong can be redeemed next season. What Adrianople reveals is that the Empire's reserve capacity is no longer as secure as its language suggests. Trained troops are expensive and slow to replace. Experienced officers are not produced overnight. Confidence among subject populations, frontier allies and rival peoples does not recover automatically once shattered. The psychological damage spreads outward from the battlefield faster than any official proclamation can control. If an emperor can die like this, if an imperial army can be surrounded and crushed like this, then Roman invincibility has become a fiction no one serious can fully believe anymore. There is also a deeper tactical lesson, though ancient writers do not always state it cleanly. Rome's enemies are no longer to be imagined as disorganized masses that will collapse once met by disciplined regulars. The Gothic forces confronting Valens are adaptive, mobile, and capable of coordinated action under pressure. They are not Roman in the institutional sense, but neither are they primitive in the crude way Roman rhetoric often implies. They have learned from long contact with imperial warfare. They understand negotiation delay maneuver and the value of cavalry arriving at the right moment. They are formidable because they have been shaped in the same frontier world Rome once dominated more confidently. Adrianople is not civilization falling to chaos. It is an empire discovering that the people it mishandled have become capable of defeating it in a set-piece disaster. What follows is not immediate extinction, but something perhaps more dangerous: adaptation under humiliation. The Roman state must now respond to a crisis it cannot narrate as a brief anomaly. The Goths remain a problem after the battle. They cannot simply be exterminated or expelled at once. The empire lacks the means for such clean closure. Instead, there is more campaigning, more negotiation, more compromise. Eventually, under Theodosius I, Gothic groups are settled under treaty arrangements within the empire in a manner that preserves peace for the moment, but leaves fundamental questions unanswered. How loyal are these federate forces? How fully are they integrated? Who really commands them in practice? How long can Rome rely on armed groups inside its territory without making itself dependent on bargains it may later regret? Adrianople does not invent these questions, but it makes them unavoidable. A lesser known but revealing consequence of the battle is how much it sharpens the empire's dependence on diplomacy as a substitute for total military resolution. This is not cowardice, it is arithmetic. The state cannot afford endless annihilating campaigns against every armed population inside or near its borders, especially after losing so many troops. Treaties become more necessary. Settlements become more attractive. Accommodation becomes a survival strategy. But accommodation when entered from weakness is read differently than accommodation entered from dominance. Rome may still set terms in law. In practice, the balance has shifted. Armed outsiders now know that the empire must sometimes negotiate because it cannot always compel. That knowledge does not remain confined to the Goths. News of imperial vulnerability travels. Frontier peoples, ambitious generals, and provincial communities all adjust their expectations. Some may seek advantage, some may simply lose faith. Either way, the battle's significance radiates beyond Thrace. An empire held together by confidence has suffered a public wound to confidence. And because the Roman world is interconnected by roads, correspondence rank patronage, and rumour that wound is not local. It is discussed in courts, camps, villas, and episcopal circles. Moral explanations proliferate. Some blame arrogance, others impiety, others poor generalship, others the sins of the age. Such explanations differ, but they share a common instinct. Everyone senses that the battle means more than a military setback. Yet the strangest part perhaps is how Roman the aftermath remains. The bureaucracy continues, laws are issued, taxes are demanded, officials serve, cities endure. This is typical of Rome's final centuries. Catastrophe does not produce instant theatrical endings. It produces coexistence between continuity and damage. Adrianople is therefore not the moment Rome dies. It is the moment Rome can no longer pretend that its old methods of containing danger will always suffice. The empire survives the blow, but survival now requires more compromise with forces it does not fully control, more reliance on generals, and federates, more improvisation under pressure. Each of those adaptations may be rational in the moment. Together they lead toward a world in which imperial authority is no longer absolute, even inside the imperial frame. The battle also illuminates a grim structural truth. Rome's greatest danger is no longer merely invasion from outside. It is the interaction between external pressure and internal fragmentation. The Goths are dangerous, in part because Rome has mishandled them. Valens is defeated in part because imperial coordination is imperfect, and court politics encourage haste. The losses are devastating in part because replacing them will strain a system already under tension. Adrianople is not an isolated military event. It is a concentrated expression of the empire's wider illness, and so the illusion breaks not with the final end but with recognition. Rome can still endure. It can still command, negotiate, punish, and rebuild. But after Adrianople, it can no longer mistake endurance for intact supremacy. Something essential has changed. The empire is still alive, still vast, still administratively formidable. Yet a battlefield in Thrace has shown that the machinery of Roman power is now vulnerable to the very forces it once believed it could absorb and master. That knowledge will haunt every crisis to come. After Adrianople, the empire does not enter a clean age of military reaction, so much as a more dangerous age of internal bargaining. The battlefield shock is real, but the deeper problem lies in who now controls the means of response. Armies still matter more than ever. Frontiers still need guarding. Federate groups still need managing. Revenues still have to be extracted from provinces already showing strain. Yet the imperial court, especially in the West, increasingly becomes a place where survival depends less on stable institutions than on personal rivalries, shifting favour, and the lethal distrust between emperors, ministers, and generals. Rome is not simply being attacked from outside. It is learning how efficiently its own leadership can destroy its remaining strength. The Western Empire in particular develops a fatal habit. It depends on powerful military strongmen because it has little choice. Emperors are often young, politically weak, or physically distant from the fighting. The armies must be commanded by someone competent enough to hold together a crumbling strategic world. But the moment such a commander becomes too successful, too admired, or too independent, he becomes frightening to the court he serves. This is the trap. The West cannot survive without dominant generals, yet it increasingly cannot tolerate them either. So it raises them, uses them, suspects them, undermines them, and sometimes kills them, often at exactly the moment when they are most needed. No figure reveals this more clearly than Stilicho. Of mixed Vandal background but thoroughly Roman in career and function, he rises to become the dominant military and political force behind the Western court after the death of Theodosius I in 395. The empire has just passed through a decisive moment. Theodosius, the last emperor to rule both East and West together in a fully effective sense, leaves behind two sons, Arcadius in the East and Honorius in the West. In theory, this is still one Roman Empire under two imperial courts. In practice, the arrangement becomes increasingly competitive, suspicious and fragmented. Stilicho presents himself as the guardian of the Western regime, and perhaps, depending on which source one trusts as a protector, with wider claims to imperial stewardship. Whatever his precise ambitions, he is exactly the sort of man the age produces: indispensable, heavily armed, politically controversial, and impossible to fit comfortably within old constitutional language. The Western court under Honorius is not Rome in its old confident form. It is a nervous political organism moving between centres such as Milan and later Ravenna, closer to defensible terrain and farther from the exposed symbolism of the ancient capital. Ravenna in particular, ringed by marshland and easier to defend, is a revealing choice. It offers security, but it also signals fear. The Western Empire is beginning to govern from places designed to survive siege and intrigue rather than to project untroubled supremacy. This is not an empire at ease. It is an empire crouching. Stilicho has real ability. He campaigns against threats in Italy, and the Balkans maneuvers against Alaric and the Goths, and tries to keep the Western military system functioning with resources that are never quite enough. He is not a saviour in the romantic sense. Scholars still debate aspects of his policy, and the evidence remains incomplete regarding how much of his strategy was long-term vision and how much was improvisation. But what survives in the record suggests a commander working inside impossible constraints: too many frontiers, too little money, too much rivalry with the Eastern court, and too much dependence on barbarian troops because the Western manpower base and fiscal structure are under constant strain. He can delay disaster. He cannot remove the conditions producing it. This is where court politics become actively destructive. A strong general may win battles, but he also acquires clients, loyal troops, prestige and influence over succession and policy. To frightened courtiers, that begins to look like a monarchy within the monarchy. Rumour thrives in such an atmosphere. Accusations of treason, private ambition, barbarian sympathy and secret bargaining with enemies become tools of political survival. Stilicho, precisely because he deals with Gothic forces and uses non-Roman troops, becomes easy to smear as insufficiently Roman, insufficiently loyal, or dangerously self-serving. This is one of the bitter ironies of the age. The empire increasingly relies on men who understand how to work with frontier peoples and mixed armies, then punishes them for embodying the very world Rome has created. In 408, Stilicho falls. He is arrested and executed after a court coup driven by distrust, factional maneuvering, and the Emperor Honorius's weakness. It is hard to exaggerate how disastrous this is. The West has not eliminated a threat. It has amputated one of the few functioning command structures it still possesses. Worse than that, the purge that follows turns suspicion into policy. Many families of barbarian troops serving Rome are massacred or targeted so viciously that large numbers of those soldiers flee to Alaric. The state in effect throws trained manpower into the arms of its enemy because panic at court outweighs strategic sense. Few episodes reveal the self-destructive tendencies of the late Western Empire more clearly than this. Rome is not merely losing control. It is actively dismantling its own capacity to recover. Alaric himself embodies the ambiguity of the age. He is often remembered as a barbarian invader, and that is not wrong, but it is incomplete. He has long moved within the Roman military world, served under Roman authority, and sought status office and secure provision for his followers through negotiation with the empire. He's not trying to erase Rome as an idea. He's trying to force Rome to deal with him on terms that will sustain his people and elevate his position. That makes him more dangerous, not less. A pure external enemy can be fought. A leader shaped by Roman systems understands their weaknesses intimately. He knows how to exploit delays, factionalism, supply problems, and symbolic pressure. His campaigns in Italy are not just invasions. They are arguments conducted with armies. Meanwhile, the rivalry between Eastern and Western courts makes every crisis harder. The East survives Adrianople and continues to function with greater structural strength, deeper resources, and more stable urban wealth. But Eastern help for the West is uneven, cautious, and shaped by its own interests. This is understandable from a court in Constantinople, guarding its own frontiers and political balance. Yet from the perspective of the West, it is fatal. The empire still claims unity, but coordination is not automatic. A Western crisis may not produce full Eastern rescue. Each court calculates, each watches the other. The result is a divided Roman response to dangers that do not respect the administrative line between East and West. There is another quieter but equally corrosive problem. The emperor in the West becomes increasingly ceremonial compared with the men who actually move armies and manage emergencies. Honorius is not uniquely foolish in every respect, as older, hostile traditions sometimes implies, but he is politically weak in the ways that matter most. The throne remains symbolically central, yet real initiative migrates to generals, ministers, and palace factions. That gap between title and function breeds instability. If everyone knows the emperor depends on others to rule, then the struggle shifts to controlling access to the emperor. Court government becomes less about coherent statecraft and more about proximity, whisper networks, and tactical elimination of rivals. An empire can survive poor rulers for a surprisingly long time. It survives court systems much less easily when they systematically target competence. A lesser-known but deeply revealing feature of these years is how often military planning is subordinated to fear of political appearances. Waiting for reinforcements may look weak. Negotiating with an enemy may look dishonorable. Empowering a general may look dangerous. Refusing to empower him may be even more dangerous but less immediately threatening to courtiers. This is the logic that slowly ruins the West. Decisions are made not only against external enemies, but against imagined internal rivals, and often the imagined rival feels more urgent because he is closer, more visible, and more capable of reshaping court hierarchy. The empire behaves like a body whose immune system attacks the organs trying hardest to keep it alive. By the early 5th century, the Western Empire is therefore fighting on several fronts at once, even when no battle is underway. It fights Goths and other armed groups in the field. It fights fiscal depletion in its provinces. It fights communication problems across a huge territory. It fights the slow erosion of confidence among local elites and populations. And at the centre, it fights itself. That last struggle may be the most destructive because it turns every talented commander into a potential traitor, and every necessary compromise into evidence of corruption. The court meant to coordinate survival becomes a machine for consuming trust. This does not mean all blame lies with palace intrigue. No single explanation fully accounts for the destruction that follows. External pressure is real. Structural weakness is real. The difficulty of sustaining armies across such distances is real, but the Western court takes those difficulties and magnifies them. It repeatedly chooses short-term safety inside the palace over long-term security in the provinces. It repeatedly sacrifices experienced leadership to suspicion. It repeatedly confuses control of appearances with control of reality. And so the empire drifts toward one of its most famous humiliations, not because it has ceased to possess armies or laws or emperors, but because the nerve center that should coordinate those assets has become fatally unstable. The generals are too powerful to trust and too necessary to lose. The courtiers are too frightened to think strategically. The emperor is too insulated to master events directly. Outside the court, enemies watch closely. Inside it, ambition and fear do their work. The West is still Roman, still legal, still ceremonially majestic. But more and more of its future is being decided by intrigue in defended capitals, rather than by confident command of the world it claims to rule. When the city of Rome is finally sacked in 410, the damage is not measured only in fire loot, and the violation of houses that had stood under the protection of centuries. The deeper damage is psychological. Armies have marched across provinces before. Frontier towns have burned before. Emperors have fallen before. But Rome is not just another city. By the early 5th century, it is no longer the daily working capital of empire, no longer the place from which military crisis is usually managed, and no longer the sole centre of Roman political gravity. Yet it remains something almost larger than government. It is memory turned into stone. It is the theatre in which Roman greatness has taught itself how to imagine permanence. To see Rome entered by a hostile force is to see the myth of untouchability broken in public. Alaric does not begin as a man trying simply to burn the world. For years he has moved between war and negotiation, pressing the Western court for office payment land and secure status for his followers. He understands that the empire still contains resources worth bargaining for. His campaigns in Italy are not random destruction. They are strategic pressure applied to a government that keeps delaying, dividing, and deceiving. The Western court, now safe behind the marshes of Ravenna, is harder to strike directly than the old capital, and this changes the logic of war. If the emperor will not come out, if the court will not settle terms, then the symbolic body of Rome becomes the lever. Italy itself becomes hostage to imperial indecision. This is one of the most revealing features of the age. The empire's political centre and its symbolic centre are no longer the same place, and enemies learn quickly how to exploit that separation. To threaten Rome is not necessarily to destroy the administrative machine. The tax offices, court factions, military bureau, and chains of command that still keep the West alive are located elsewhere. But to threaten Rome is to injure the moral architecture of the Roman world. It is to turn the ancient capital into evidence that imperial claims are no longer absolute. Alaric, shaped by long experience with Roman politics, understands this perfectly. The road to the sack is crowded with failed diplomacy. There are sieges, negotiations, embassies, and moments when a settlement still seems possible. The city itself, immense though diminished from its ancient peak, is vulnerable to blockade. Rome depends on supply, and hunger is one of the oldest weapons in war. As Alaric's forces close around it, scarcity begins to work from within. Senators bargain, clergy intervene, the population suffers. The empire still possesses armies elsewhere, at least in theory, but theory is not the same as rescue. Ravenna hesitates, maneuvers, and calculates. The court fears concession because concession may look weak. It fears military action because military action may fail. It fears empowering any rival solution that might reduce its own control. This is the paralysis of the late Western Empire in miniature, too proud to settle cleanly, too divided to strike decisively, too politically brittle to recognize that delay itself is becoming a weapon in enemy hands. There is a grim irony in the fact that Rome, which once starved besieged cities into obedience across the Mediterranean world, now feels the pressure of encirclement itself. Grain supplies become critical. Desperation sharpens political divisions inside the city. Gold, silver, and luxury goods are gathered for ransom. Statues are stripped for metal. The old capital repository of triumphs and inherited grandeur begins to consume its own ornaments to buy time. Even if one strips away the more dramatic flourishes of hostile or moralizing sources, the image remains devastating. Rome is no longer projecting abundance outward. It is scraping wealth together under duress. When the sack finally comes in August 410, it lasts 3 days. Later imagination often turns it into an apocalypse of endless slaughter and universal destruction, but the reality is more complex. The city is violated, looted, and deeply humiliated, yet not erased from the earth. Some churches appear to function as places of refuge, at least in the Christian telling, that quickly develops around the event. Some neighborhoods suffer more than others. Some aristocratic houses are stripped. Captives are taken. Wealth changes hands. The violence is real, but it is uneven, not a single sheet of fire across every district. This matters because it reveals the nature of the shock. Rome's importance lies not in total physical annihilation, but in the fact that such a city could be entered and plundered at all. That distinction is easy to miss. If Rome had been burned flat, later generations might have understood the event only as a catastrophe of matter. Instead, it becomes something more haunting, a catastrophe of meaning. The city survives, but its symbolic invulnerability does not. What has been damaged is not only walls and treasure. What has been damaged is the Roman sense that there remains somewhere a centre, too old, too sacred, too prestigious to be handled like any other prize of war. After 410, that confidence cannot be restored. One can rebuild houses, one can replace plate and furniture. One cannot easily restore the lost imagination of immunity. The reaction across the Roman world makes this clear. Writers, bishops, aristocrats, and moralists struggle to explain what has happened. Some interpret it as divine punishment, others as a test, others as proof of moral corruption or political failure. Augustine, writing in North Africa, will eventually respond to the wider spiritual crisis by labouring to separate the fate of the earthly city from the destiny of the heavenly one. That intellectual response alone tells us how deeply the event cuts. The sack is not received as one more military misfortune. It is treated as a wound to civilization's story about itself. Scholars still debate how ordinary people outside elite circles understood it, because the surviving voices are limited and often highly rhetorical. But what survives in the record suggests alarm far beyond Italy. Refugees move, news spreads. The prestige of empire suffers another public fracture. For the Western aristocracy, the shock is intimate. Many of the greatest senatorial families still maintain residences, patronage networks, and emotional investment in Rome even if the court now sits elsewhere. Their city is not merely a place of old monuments. It is a living landscape of rank memory and identity. To see it looted by Alaric's forces is to discover that inherited status no longer guarantees imperial protection. Some aristocrats flee, some adapt. Some reposition themselves within church networks or provincial estates. This is an important but often overlooked consequence of the sack. It accelerates the reorientation of elite life. If the old centre is exposed, then power, security, and meaning must be sought through other channels. And yet the Western court in Ravenna survives. That too is revealing. The sack does not destroy the imperial government directly. Honorius remains emperor. Laws continue to be issued. Offices continue to function. This coexistence between symbolic catastrophe and bureaucratic continuity is one of the strangest features of late Roman history. The empire is badly wounded, but it is not theatrically finished. That makes the event both easier and harder to interpret. Easier because it clearly shows humiliation. Harder because humiliation does not immediately produce extinction. Rome has been sacked, and yet Rome still governs. The name lives on even as its authority is thinned. There is a lesser known and telling detail in the diplomacy surrounding the crisis. Alaric repeatedly appears less interested in abolishing the empire than in forcing it to recognize and sustain his military community within Roman terms. He seeks office settlement, legitimacy provision. That does not make him less destructive. It makes him a perfect product of the late imperial world. The empire has created a political environment in which armed leaders on its margins or within its orbit increasingly seek not to overthrow Roman structures outright, but to occupy them, redirect them, or use them for their own followers. The sack of Rome is therefore not an assault from a wholly alien universe. It is an assault by forces deeply entangled with Rome's own military and diplomatic habits. This is why the event changes everything. Not because it instantly ends the Western Empire, but because it makes visible a truth that had been building for decades. The empire can no longer protect its most sacred symbols from the consequences of its own fragmentation. The court's intrigues, the execution of Stilicho, the failure to settle Alaric effectively, the reliance on federate politics, the shrinking capacity for coordinated military action, all of it converges here. The sack is the public proof that the West's internal weakness is now producing irreversible external humiliation. After 410, every province, every commander, every ambitious outsider understands a little more clearly what the West has become. Still formidable in appearance, still draped in law and title, yet unable to prevent enemies from striking at the heart of its memory. That is why the sack matters beyond its 3 days. It changes the scale of the imaginable. If Rome can be entered, then nothing in the Western order feels entirely secure again. If the sack of Rome tears through the empire's imagination, the loss of North Africa tears through its stomach, its treasury, and its remaining chance of military recovery. This is one of the most decisive turns in the destruction of the Western Empire, and one of the easiest for modern audiences to underestimate because maps can make provinces look interchangeable. They are not. North Africa is not a distant ornament. It is one of the Western Mediterranean's richest and most productive regions, a landscape of estates, ports, tax revenue, olive oil grain, and administrative reliability. Carthage in particular is not merely an old enemy's city turned Roman. By late antiquity, it is one of the great urban centres of the Western Empire, tied deeply into the fiscal and supply systems that keep Italy and the Western court functioning. To lose Africa is not like losing a remote border district. It is like cutting away one of the empire's healthiest organs. This is why the Vandals matter so much. In popular memory, they often survive as little more than shorthand for destruction, a people remembered mainly through the later insult vandalism, as though they appear suddenly to smash and burn. The reality is more consequential and more Roman than that crude picture suggests. The Vandals are one among several groups moving through the unstable Western provinces in the early 5th century, carried along by the same combination of migration opportunism, military pressure, and imperial weakness that has already transformed Gaul and Spain. They cross into the empire, survive within it, and adapt to its fractures. By the time they move toward Africa under their king Gaiseric, they are not a wandering accident. They are a hardened political and military community learning how to turn Roman weakness into permanent advantage. The background is already ominous. In 406, a great crossing of the Rhine opens the western provinces to multiple armed groups, among them Vandals, Suebi, and Alans. Scholars still debate the exact circumstances of that crossing, and how coordinated it truly was, but the broader consequence is undeniable. Gaul becomes a zone of penetration, local devastation, and political improvisation. Imperial control does not vanish overnight, but it weakens badly. From there, instability rolls into Spain, where competing Roman authorities, local elites, and migrating groups carve out an increasingly fragmented landscape. The Western government, already strained by court intrigue, and the aftermath of Alaric's campaigns cannot restore order everywhere at once. This is the recurring Western pattern now. Crises multiply faster than resources. Africa, for a time, seems safer than these exposed provinces. It is wealthy, relatively urbanized, deeply Romanized in administration, and separated by sea from some of the continental chaos. But the Western Empire's very dependence on it makes it vulnerable. Any serious challenge there will strike beyond local borders. Grain and tax revenue from Africa support Italy and the Western state more broadly. Carthage is a naval and commercial hinge. If a hostile power takes root in Africa, the balance of the Western Mediterranean changes immediately. Suddenly, the sea is not a Roman lake secured by inherited supremacy. It becomes contested space. The Vandals arrive in Africa in 429, invited perhaps by internal Roman conflict, or at least enabled by it. The details are still debated. The old story that the Roman commander Boniface deliberately called them in as allies against rivals may contain some truth, some distortion, or a mixture of both because the evidence remains incomplete, and later accounts are eager to personalize systemic failure. But whether invited, exploited, or merely opportunistic, the Vandals are once again entering through a gate widened by Roman civil division. That pattern should now feel familiar. The Empire's enemies do not simply batter down walls. They are repeatedly admitted, redirected, or empowered by Roman factions trying to solve immediate political problems with forces they later cannot control. Gaiseric, their king, proves one of the most formidable leaders of the age. He is patient, adaptive, politically shrewd, and fully capable of understanding Roman structures well enough to exploit them. He does not need to destroy everything to win. He needs to secure a base, preserve his people, and take over the revenue and logistical systems that once sustained Roman power. In this sense, the Vandal conquest of Africa is not just invasion, it is appropriation. Roman estates continue to matter. Roman ports continue to matter. Roman tax mechanisms, shipping lanes, and urban infrastructures do not become useless because a non-Roman dynasty now commands them. They become tools in different hands. That is what makes the loss so devastating. The Western state cannot easily replace Africa's contribution. Grain for Rome and Italy becomes less secure. Revenue for paying armies shrinks sharply. Naval capacity matters more because the sea lanes are now threatened from a hostile African shore. The court in Ravenna, already adept at surviving symbolically while losing substance, materially finds itself with fewer and fewer reserves from which to improvise. This is the quiet mathematics of destruction. An empire may endure one humiliation, one frontier rupture, one civil war, even one sack of its ancient capital, but lose the province that helps feed the heartland and finance the military, and survival becomes a narrower and harsher business. The capture of Carthage in 439 is therefore a turning point of the First Order. It is hard to overstate the significance. A major Roman city, one of the jewels of the western provinces, falls into Vandal hands, and with it a massive concentration of economic and strategic value. The Western Empire does not cease to exist on that day, but after that day it exists with a gaping wound at its financial centre. Scholars still debate whether the Western state might have recovered under unusually favourable circumstances because history always contains lost possibilities. Yet what survives in the record suggests that after Africa is lost, the West's room for recovery shrinks dramatically. Armies need money, allies need payment, fleets need maintenance, bureaucracy needs revenue, loyalty itself often needs subsidy. Africa has supplied all of these indirectly or directly. Without it, the Western government becomes a court managing scarcity rather than a state commanding abundance. There is also a maritime transformation that follows. Vandal naval power, often underappreciated in simplified narratives, becomes a major strategic problem. From African bases, Vandal forces can raid islands, coasts and shipping routes across the Western Mediterranean. Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the approaches to Italy all become more exposed. This matters not only for physical damage, but for confidence and commerce. Sea movement, once one of Rome's greatest strengths, becomes less reliable. The Mediterranean had long served as the connective tissue of the empire. Now, at least in the Western Basin, it starts to behave less like a Roman highway and more like a contested frontier. That change alone would be serious. Combined with the fiscal losses of Africa itself, it is crippling. The Western court does attempt responses. Campaigns are planned, diplomacy is pursued. At moments, there are serious efforts, sometimes with Eastern cooperation, to recover Africa. One of the most dramatic comes later in the century, with the massive but ultimately disastrous expedition of 468 mounted largely by the Eastern Empire to strike the Vandals and restore Roman control. Its failure is catastrophic in financial terms and reveals again how much is now at stake. Even the surviving Eastern court, stronger and richer than the West, finds the project ruinously expensive. If the East struggles to reverse the loss, the West alone was never likely to do so once the province had slipped away. There is a lesser-known but revealing human consequence to all this. The loss of Africa does not merely weaken emperors and generals, it reshapes the daily life of regions still nominally Roman. Grain distribution becomes more precarious, urban provisioning grows harder, tax pressure may intensify elsewhere as the state tries to compensate for vanished revenue. Local elites in Italy and Gaul can see more clearly that the imperial centre is no longer capable of guaranteeing the material foundations of the order it claims to preserve. When that realization spreads, political loyalty changes character. Office becomes less attractive. Local survival becomes more rational. The empire begins to feel not like a mutual structure of protection, but like a desperate institution asking for more while offering less. This is the moment when the West begins to starve in a broader sense than food alone. It starves for money, for troop reliability, for naval control, for strategic options, for confidence. It still possesses laws, titles, bishops, noble families, and defended cities. It still possesses the imperial name. But beneath that name, the ability to act decisively across the Western Mediterranean has been maimed. The Vandals do not just take a province, they take time, leverage, and possibility away from the Western state. Every later crisis unfolds in the shadow of that loss. No single explanation fully accounts for Rome's destruction, and it would be too simple to say that Africa alone doomed the West. The empire was already wounded by internal rivalries, military fragmentation, frontier penetration, and administrative strain. But Africa transforms weakness into near-fatal deficiency. It removes the cushion that might have absorbed future shocks. It turns crisis management into attrition. It ensures that when the West faces the next generation of pressures, it will do so with fewer coins, fewer ships, and fewer choices. The old empire had survived because it could turn wealth into order on an immense scale. Now one of the richest engines of that conversion is gone. The court in Ravenna remains, the emperor remains, the paperwork remains, but the substance behind them grows thinner. Rome does not yet look dead. It looks underfed, overexposed, and increasingly unable to nourish the world it still claims to rule. That is how great powers often begin to fail most visibly, not when the ceremonies stop, but when the grain ships and tax streams no longer arrive as they once did. By now the temptation is to search for one final answer, one clean cause that can explain why the Western Roman Empire is no longer able to recover. It is an understandable temptation. Human beings prefer endings with shape. A state this famous seems as though it should have a single fatal flaw, a central betrayal, a decisive battle, a moral weakness that explains the rest. But the closer the evidence is examined, the less satisfying single cause answers become. Rome in the West is not destroyed by one thing. It is destroyed by the interaction of many things, each making the others harder to survive. Invasion matters, civil war matters, economic disruption matters, political murder matters, disease matters, climatic instability may matter in ways still debated. The empire is not struck by one hammer. It is weakened by repeated blows landing on the same damaged body. This is why the old arguments between internal decay and barbarian invasion have always been too neat. Rome is not a healthy structure suddenly overwhelmed from outside, nor is it a rotten shell that would have fallen even in perfect isolation. It is a still formidable empire whose internal fractures make it vulnerable to external enemies, while external pressures intensify internal fractures until neither can be separated from the other. The Goths, Vandals, Huns, Suebi Burgundians and others do not operate in a vacuum. They move through a Roman world already shaped by military overstretch, contested succession, rising dependence on federate troops, and the repeated diversion of armies into civil conflict. At the same time, those Roman weaknesses do not remain abstract. They become deadly because armed outsiders can exploit them. What destroys the West is not one side of that equation, but the collision between them. Take invasion first because it is the most visible part of the story and the easiest to dramatize. Armed groups enter the empire, seize territory, plunder cities, negotiate from strength, and eventually carve out kingdoms within former Roman provinces. That is real. It matters enormously. The loss of effective imperial control in Gaul, Spain, Africa, and eventually much of Italy, cannot be described honestly without acknowledging sustained military pressure from non-imperial powers. But invasion alone does not explain why these groups succeed. Earlier Rome defeated, absorbed, or contained dangerous enemies repeatedly. What has changed is not merely the existence of enemies, it is the weakening of Rome's capacity to answer them coherently. That capacity has been damaged for generations by civil war. Here lies one of the most underappreciated truths of the late empire. Roman armies are at least as dangerous to Roman stability as foreign ones when they're drawn into succession struggles and court rivalries. Troops withdrawn from a frontier to support a claimant leave another region exposed. Commanders become political actors because political actors need commanders. Provinces become bargaining zones. Tax revenue is spent to win internal contests instead of securing strategic continuity. The empire teaches its enemies a crucial lesson every time it turns inward. Wait long enough, and Romans will weaken themselves. What survives in the record suggests that this habit of self-consumption is one of the great engines of imperial destruction. It is not dramatic in the way a sack is dramatic, but it is perhaps even more consequential. Then there is the economy, though that word can be too broad and less anchored in physical realities. What does economic breakdown mean in practice? It means coinage that no longer carries unquestioned trust. It means tax burdens that grow harsher as the state's needs rise and its reliable revenue base shrinks. It means estates devastated by raid or confiscation. It means transport made less secure by war and piracy. It means provinces like Africa, once central to supply and finance, passing into hostile hands. It means urban life becoming harder to sustain at former scale. It means local elites deciding that cooperation with the imperial centre offers diminishing returns. The Roman economy is never purely monetary, never purely local, never purely centralized. It is a mesh of taxation, landholding, labour, transport, state demand and private exchange. When war and political fragmentation repeatedly strike, that mesh, the damage is cumulative. Grain does not arrive where it is expected. Soldiers are paid late or inadequately. Repair work is deferred. Confidence thins. There is also the matter of military composition. Rome has long used non-Roman troops. In itself, that is not new, and not necessarily a sign of weakness. The empire's strength has often depended on its ability to recruit widely and transform outsiders into instruments of Roman power. Yet in the late West, the balance changes. The state becomes less able to replace losses through stable internal mechanisms and more dependent on negotiated military relationships with leaders whose followers remain loyal first to them. Federate arrangements, barbarian commanders, semi-autonomous armed settlements. These are not temporary exceptions anymore. They become normal features of Western survival. Sometimes they are indispensable, sometimes they are ruinous. Usually they are both at once. Rome needs these forces because its own structures are under strain. But each reliance further erodes the state's monopoly on violence. An empire can survive sharing military labour. It survives much less easily when it shares military authority. Political murder and elite rivalry sharpen everything. Competent generals are executed because they are feared. Courts consume their own defenders. Emperors become hostages to faction or symbols without power. The West repeatedly loses men it cannot afford to lose. This is not just incompetence in the abstract. It is a specific failure of political culture under stress. A court afraid of being dominated by a general may destroy him only to discover that the provinces he held together now fall apart. A military commander may seek emergency solutions that look like treason to civilians. A provincial elite may keep wealth local, rather than risk it on a centre that no longer protects them reliably. Every actor makes choices that can seem rational in the short term. Collectively, those choices dismantle the possibility of imperial recovery. Disease belongs in this picture too, even if its exact effect remain debated. Epidemics in the Roman world are hard to measure with precision, especially across centuries and regions, but it would be a mistake to treat them as background noise. Repeated disease shocks reduce manpower, weaken tax bases, unsettle army recruitment, and magnify the burden on already stressed communities. A plague does not need to exterminate half the empire to matter politically. It only needs to make replenishment slower, survival harsher, and existing structures more brittle. The evidence remains incomplete on the exact scale of some outbreaks, yet what survives in the record suggests that epidemic disease repeatedly compounds other weaknesses rather than replacing them as an explanation. Climate is more difficult still, and scholars remain cautious for good reason. The ancient climate is not a simple story of one shift causing one collapse. Yet environmental stress may have contributed to the volatility of this period in ways earlier historians could not fully trace. Changes in rainfall patterns, harvest instability, and the broader ecological shocks associated with what some now call the late antique Little Ice Age belong mostly to the later 5th and 6th centuries, though earlier regional fluctuations also matter. The safest conclusion is not that climate destroyed Rome, but that environmental stress likely interacted with war migration and disease to make an already unstable system harder to stabilize. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and the temptation to oversimplify nature into destiny should be resisted. Even so, empires are never independent of weather harvest and transport. When these grow less predictable, strained governments feel it immediately. And then there is ideology, not in the narrow sense of abstract belief alone, but in the broader sense of what people think the empire is for. Rome survives for so long because many different groups believe they have a stake in its continuation. Provincial elites gain office and honour. Cities gain prestige and infrastructure. Soldiers gain pay and status. Clergy eventually gain imperial patronage and protection. Peasants, even under heavy burdens, may still prefer taxed order to open predation. But once the state's ability to protect and reward declines too far, that shared investment weakens. Loyalty becomes conditional. Localism becomes rational. Bishops, landowners, and regional strongmen increasingly step into spaces the imperial centre no longer fills well. That is not betrayal in the melodramatic sense. It is adaptation. Yet each adaptation to imperial weakness makes the centre weaker still. A lesser known but revealing clue to the multi-causal nature of Rome's destruction lies in how uneven it is across regions. The East does not vanish when the West does. Some Western provinces hold longer than others. Some cities contract gradually rather than collapsing overnight. Some barbarian kings preserve Roman law tax habits and administrative forms because they find them useful. This unevenness is a warning against monocausal explanations. If sheer barbarian ferocity were the answer, one might expect a more uniform ruin. If moral decay alone were the answer, one would need to explain why some Roman institutions remain stubbornly effective elsewhere. The patchwork outcome tells us that local conditions, revenue structures, military geography, and political choices all matter. Rome is destroyed not by a universal law of history, but by a series of specific failures and shocks converging on its weaker half. This is what makes the Western Empire's end so instructive and so unnerving. Great systems rarely die for one reason. They die because many manageable problems begin reinforcing one another. A frontier breach reduces revenue. Reduced revenue weakens armies. Weakened armies encourage further breaches. Civil war pulls troops away. Troops pulled away invite raids. Raids devastate land. Devastated land shrinks taxation. Shrunken taxation deepens court panic. Court panic produces purges. Purges remove competence. Lost competence makes every later emergency harder. Over time, the system becomes less a machine of recovery than a machine of amplifying damage. By the middle of the 5th century, this cumulative logic has become unmistakable. The West still has emperors, titles, and ceremonies. It still has Roman generals, Roman laws, Roman bishops, Roman cities, and Roman habits of administration. But these no longer add up to a state capable of restoring itself on the old scale. The destruction is now systemic. Not one blow, but many. Not one enemy, but several. Not one betrayal, but a culture of repeated short-term bargains. Rome is being destroyed because every layer of its strength is now asked to compensate for failures elsewhere, until the layers themselves begin to fail together. By the middle decades of the 5th century, the Western Empire still exists, but it exists in a strangely hollowed form, like a great building, whose facade remains grand while more and more of the rooms behind it stand empty, damaged or occupied by people with other plans. The emperor is still there, the court is still there, laws are still issued in the old Roman style with all the usual weight of command and continuity. Consuls are still named, titles still glitter, ceremonies still reassure those who need reassurance. But real power has become something harder to locate and harder to trust. It moves through generals, palace factions, regional strongmen, bishops, military households, and kings who are not Roman in origin, yet increasingly operate inside Roman political space, as though it belongs to them too. The last Western emperors do not preside over a stable decline. They preside over a world in which the imperial office survives longer than the imperial capacity to control events. This is one of the strangest and most revealing phases in the whole story, because outward continuity becomes almost deceptive in its persistence. A child can still be raised to think the empire is real, because it is still visible in forms in ranks in the memory of what the state has been for centuries. The imperial name still commands habit. Administrators still know how to draft decrees. Aristocrats still seek titles. The church still interacts with emperors as if the office remains central. Yet on the ground, power is increasingly conditional. Regions are managed through personal arrangements rather than unquestioned hierarchy. Armies are assembled through bargains. Taxation is harder to enforce consistently. Communications still function, but they travel through a world of local calculation. The Western Empire has become a regime of appearances trying to negotiate with realities it can no longer master. The emperors themselves reflect this new condition. Few are allowed the stature of true rulers. Many are elevated because they're useful to someone else. Some are children, some are placeholders. Some are little more than names attached to the orders of stronger men. This is not because the imperial title has lost all meaning. On the contrary, it still means enough that generals and faction leaders continue to need it. Legitimacy remains a precious resource. A commander may hold the army, but an emperor still makes command look lawful. A usurper still wants recognition. A barbarian king still benefits from Roman endorsement. That is why the title survives. It is useful even after it has ceased to control the world that once gave it substance. Among the men who dominate this era, Aetius stands out. He is in many ways the last great Western Roman strongman, a figure both impressive and symptomatic. He knows the frontier world intimately, has deep experience with diplomacy and warfare among non-Roman peoples, and becomes the principal defender of the Western regime for decades. Like Stilicho before him, he is exactly the kind of man the late West needs, and exactly the kind of man its political culture is built to mistrust. He maneuvers among Huns, Visigoths, Burgundians, Franks, and imperial factions with a level of flexibility that would have looked alarming even in a stronger age. In a weaker one, it is indispensable. Aetius does not restore the West to old wholeness. No one could. What he does is hold together fragments, delay certain disasters, and use diplomacy as intelligently as force. He understands that the empire can no longer fight every enemy directly with overwhelming superiority. Instead, it must balance one group against another, preserve key territories, and keep the imperial structure alive long enough for negotiation to remain possible. This is not heroic in the old Roman sense of total victory. It is something grimmer and more modern strategic management of decline under permanent emergency. Scholars still debate whether any Western commander could have done substantially more under the circumstances, because the evidence remains incomplete and the constraints were immense. But what survives in the record suggests that Aetius prolongs the life of the Western Empire by sheer political and military skill. The most famous moment of his career comes with Attila and the Huns. By the 440s and early 450s, the Hunnic Confederation has become one of the most feared powers in Europe, not because it seeks to settle quietly within Roman administration, but because it can extract tribute, devastate wide regions, and move with terrifying speed. The Eastern Empire has already paid heavily to manage the threat. Now the West must face it more directly. Attila's invasion of Gaul in 451 produces one of those battles later ages love to turn into legend, the conflict often called the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Roman Visigothic and other forces confront the Huns in a coalition that is itself a perfect sign of the times. Rome can no longer defend the West with purely Roman power. It must coordinate with barbarian allies to repel a still more dangerous barbarian empire. The battle is important, but its meaning is often exaggerated or misunderstood. It is not the salvation of an intact Rome. It is the defense of a weakened Roman order through a coalition of forces whose interests only partly align. Even victory, if victory it truly is, in the clean sense later narratives prefer, does not restore the West's old strength. It merely averts one immediate catastrophe. The empire still depends on Aetius afterward. It still lacks Africa. It still struggles with revenue control and military coherence. Yet the battle does show something crucial. The imperial office may be diminished, but the Roman political framework still matters enough to organize resistance. That too is part of the tragedy. The West dies not because nothing is left, but because what is left is not enough. Then comes one of the most ruinous acts of self-destruction in the entire story. In 454, Emperor Valentinian III personally kills Aetius, reportedly striking him down in a palace setting after being persuaded that his great general has become too powerful and too dangerous. The details, as with so much in late Roman political murder, arrive through sources coloured by hindsight and moral drama. But the basic fact is clear enough, and its significance is devastating. The emperor eliminates the man who has done more than anyone else to hold the Western structure together. It is the Stilicho pattern repeated in even starker form. The court once again removes the protector it fears because it cannot imagine how to live safely beside him. A famous remark is later attributed to a courtier who tells Valentinian that he has cut off his right hand with his left. Whether the line is authentic or polished by later retelling hardly matters because it captures the truth perfectly. Aetius is not merely a commander among others, he is a keystone. Remove him, and the already unstable arrangement begins to sag immediately. The emperor does not regain full control by killing him. He loses the one man most capable of managing the disorder around him. Within a year, Valentinian himself is assassinated. The centre has now consumed both its strongest general and its emperor in quick succession. Few episodes could better illustrate the late West's inability to preserve the people it most needs. After this, the imperial throne becomes even more obviously a prize moved by others. Petronius, Maximus, Avitus, Majorian, Libius, Severus, Anthemius, Olybrius, Glycerius, Julius Nepos. These names pass across the late Western stage in a sequence that is less a line of rulers than a record of instability. Some have regional backing, some are imposed by generals, some are accepted reluctantly by the East, others not fully at all. Some show flashes of seriousness. Majorian in particular deserves attention because he is one of the last emperors who appears to understand the scale of the Western crisis and to attempt real restoration. He reforms campaigns and plans a major effort to recover Africa from the Vandals. It is one of the last moments when the Western Empire seems capable of something more than ceremonial survival, and then it fails. Majorian's African expedition never succeeds. The fleet assembled for it is destroyed perhaps by Vandal action, perhaps through betrayal, perhaps through a combination of weakness and bad fortune. Soon after, Majorian is deposed and killed by Ricimer, the powerful military strongman behind much of Western politics in this period. Ricimer himself is a near-perfect symbol of the Hollow West, not emperor yet maker and unmaker of emperors, not fully an outsider, yet never fully able or willing to restore Roman centrality, indispensable, dangerous, and trapped within a system where personal dominance does not equal institutional recovery. Under him, and men like him, the empire continues but more as a theatre of managed fragmentation than as a state commanding unified obedience. A lesser-known but revealing aspect of these years is how often the Eastern Court still attempts to shape Western succession. Constantinople has not given up on the West entirely. It sends candidates, recognizes some rulers and not others, intervenes diplomatically, and at times backs serious attempts to revive Western order. That matters because it reminds us that Rome as a whole has not disappeared. The East still thinks in imperial terms, but its help is selective, costly, and limited by its own priorities. The West increasingly becomes a zone where Eastern legitimacy, barbarian military power, and local Roman elites all intersect without ever fully stabilizing one another. By the 400s and 70s, the office of Western Emperor is still standing, but everyone can see how little force it commands by itself. Armies obey patrons more than institutions. Italy matters, but it no longer anchors a functioning Western Mediterranean system. Gaul is fractured. Spain is largely beyond effective Western control. Africa is Vandal. Even where Roman administration persists, it often does so in partnership with powers the old empire would once have called subordinate or foreign. The emperor remains because the imperial shell still has symbolic and diplomatic use, but the shell is thinning rapidly. The last Western emperors are therefore not tragic in the old heroic sense. They are tragic because they inherit a title too large for their means, a court too weak for its ceremonies, and a world in which everyone still needs Rome's name but fewer and fewer people need Rome's commands. They do not witness a sudden collapse. They inhabit the slow exhaustion of authority until at last almost nothing remains but the costume. The year 476 has become famous because later generations need a date. They need a line in the sand, a final sunset, a single point at which the Western Roman Empire can be said to have ended, preferably with enough simplicity to fit on a page and enough drama to justify the weight of what is being lost. So the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor in Italy, becomes that point in many retellings. A child with the name of Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor seems almost too symbolically perfect to ignore. He's removed from office and the last emperor of the West is gone. It is neat. It is memorable. It is also misleading if taken too literally. By the time Romulus Augustulus is deposed, the Western Empire has already been hollow for decades. Africa is long lost. Gaul is fractured beyond effective imperial recovery. Spain is largely outside Western control. The army is no longer a stable Roman institution, in the old sense, but a shifting coalition of personal loyalties, barbarian elements, and increasingly local military realities. Emperors have risen and fallen at the will of stronger men. Titles still matter, but titles alone do not recover. Provinces secure revenues or compel obedience across the Western Mediterranean. What happens in 476 is real and important, but it is better understood as the formal acknowledgement of a condition that has been developing for a long time rather than as the instant creation of something wholly new. The immediate background is deeply characteristic of the late West. Julius Nepos, recognized by the Eastern Empire as Western Emperor, has been driven out of Italy in 475 by the Magister Militum Orestes, who places his own young son Romulus on the throne. That detail alone tells the story of the age in miniature. The imperial office has become usable political furniture. A strong man with troops can raise a son, a client, or a compliant figure, and dress him in Roman legitimacy, hoping the old forms will still do enough work to sustain real power behind the curtain. Romulus is not emperor because a stable state has elevated him through accepted succession. He is emperor because his father commands armed force and still finds the imperial title useful. Then the arrangement fails almost immediately. Orestes faces demands from federate troops in Italy, who want land settlements, a familiar and dangerous pattern in the late empire. He refuses or cannot satisfy them. Their leader Odoacer turns against him, defeats him, and kills him. Romulus, still only a boy, is deposed. Yet here the story takes its most revealing turn. Odoacer does not crown himself Western Emperor. He does not need to. Instead, he rules Italy as king while acknowledging, at least formally, the authority of the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. The imperial insignia of the West are reportedly sent east. The Western court no longer produces its own emperor in Italy. In later memory, this becomes the decisive ending. But what did it mean at the time? Scholars still debate how far contemporaries experienced 476 as an epochal break, because the evidence remains incomplete and uneven. Some certainly recognize that something important had happened. A separate Western emperor was no longer functioning in Italy. The political fiction of a fully independent Western imperial court had effectively ended. Yet for many people living through it, daily life did not suddenly become unrecognizable the morning after Romulus was removed. Odoacer preserved much of the Roman administrative framework in Italy. Senators remained, offices remained, taxation law and landholding continued in altered but recognizable forms. Roman titles were still used. The Eastern Emperor was still acknowledged. Even the idea of Roman legitimacy remained active. What disappeared was not Rome overnight, but a particular institutional arrangement already close to exhaustion. That is why 476 is both important and deceptive. Important because it marks the end of one office, the Western imperial throne in Italy, as a meaningful separate seat of government. Deceptive because it tempts later generations to imagine that before 476 Rome was alive, and after 476 it was gone, when the truth is more layered. The Western Empire had been dismembered over generations, province by province, revenue stream by revenue stream, army by army, until the imperial office itself became one more remnant waiting to be repurposed. By the time Odoacer acts, the empire in the West is no longer a unified machine that can be toppled in one motion. It is an inheritance of fragments. The deposition of Romulus matters because one fragment, the imperial facade in Italy, is finally stripped away. There is also something faintly theatrical about the whole episode which suits the late West perfectly. Romulus Augustulus is not marched dramatically into execution. He is spared and pensioned off, probably sent to live in Campania. Even his name, which later historians find irresistible, may not have carried quite the same apocalyptic resonance to everyone at the time. Augustulus itself is often treated as a dismissive nickname, little Augustus, a boy emperor presiding over a diminished office. The empire that once killed rivals in blood-soaked contests for universal rule now ends its Western line not with one last colossal battle for the world, but with a child quietly removed and a military leader deciding the costume is no longer worth wearing. There is something almost unbearably Roman in that ceremony, lingering after substance symbolism preserved, until even symbolism becomes negotiable. Odoacer's choice not to claim the imperial title is revealing in another way. It shows how strong Roman legitimacy remains even as Roman political structures fail. To rule Italy effectively, he does not need to destroy Roman language. He needs to inhabit it selectively. He can present himself as governing within the broader imperial order, now centered on Constantinople, while exercising local kingship in practice. This is not anti-Romanism, it is post-Western Roman politics. The old empire has become a source of legal prestige, diplomatic grammar and administrative habits that new rulers can use without restoring the full imperial structure that once generated them. In other words, Rome is ending as a Western state while surviving as a political vocabulary. That survival is what makes 476 such a difficult date to interpret. For schoolbook purposes, it is irresistible. For serious historical understanding, it must be handled carefully. If one asks when the Western Roman Empire fell, 476 provides a useful answer. If one asks how the Roman world in the West was destroyed, 476 is far too late to be the true beginning and far too narrow to be the whole explanation. By that date, the destruction has already happened across much of the Empire's living body. What remains is the last useful fiction. Odoacer simply discards it. A lesser-known but important complication is that Julius Nepos, the deposed Western Emperor recognized by the East, remains alive in Dalmatia until 480 and continues to be acknowledged by some as the legitimate Western ruler. That fact alone should warn against too tidy a narrative. Even after Romulus is removed, the legal question is not entirely closed. The East has not wholly abandoned the language of Western imperial legitimacy. The evidence remains incomplete regarding how widely such claims mattered outside elite political circles, but they matter enough to show that contemporaries do not all agree on a single final moment. History is messier than commemoration, and yet 476 does deserve its fame in one specific sense. It captures the transition from an empire still pretending it can recreate itself in the West to a political order that no longer bothers with the pretense. After 476, Italy is ruled openly by a king, even if that king dresses his authority in Roman forms. The Western imperial office is not revived in its old independent sense. The centre of Roman imperial continuity now lies unmistakably in the East. This is the moment when the map of legitimacy catches up at least in part with the map of reality. It is worth pausing on how quiet this ending really is compared with the noise that precedes it. The sacks, the invasions, the assassinations, the lost provinces, the failed expeditions, the murdered generals, the shrinking revenues, those are the true sounds of destruction. By contrast, 476 is almost administrative. A young emperor is removed, insignia are sent, political arrangements are adjusted, a fiction is retired. That quietness is not evidence that the event does not matter. It is evidence that the real catastrophe has already done its work. The empire is not dramatically overthrown in 476 because there is no longer much left to overthrow. This is the myth of collapse in its most seductive form, the desire to compress a centuries-long destruction into one date that feels satisfyingly final. But collapse suggests suddenness, and what happened to Rome in the West is neither sudden nor simple. 476 is better understood as the year in which later historians can stop pretending that the Western imperial office still has enough substance to anchor the old narrative. It is the end of a mask, not the first crack in the face beneath it. So when Romulus Augustulus disappears from power, the world does not end. The roads do not vanish. The cities do not all empty. Roman law is not forgotten. The Church does not suddenly speak a different language. Senators still possess memory land and ambition. Italian administration continues. Children are born into landscapes full of Roman buildings and Roman habits. The destruction of the Western Empire is real, but it is not a magic trick. It is a transfer, a thinning, a survival of forms after the centre has gone. 476 matters because it tells us that by then the West no longer even has the strength to keep pretending otherwise. Even after the Western Empire loses its emperor, Rome does not vanish. This is one of the most important and most misunderstood truths in the entire story. The political structure that once commanded the Western Mediterranean is gone, but the Roman world continues to exist in fragments, habits, institutions and identities that prove far more durable than the state that created them. The empire is destroyed, but Rome itself, in a broader sense, survives. It survives not as a single power, but as a legacy that others inherit, reshape, and sometimes struggle to understand. In Italy, Odoacer rules not as a destroyer of Roman civilization, but as a successor who finds it useful. He maintains the Senate. He works through Roman administrative systems. He issues orders that still rely on the language and structure of imperial governance. The machinery is damaged but not erased. taxation continues, though likely unevenly. Landholding patterns persist, the aristocracy adapts, the church grows in importance as a stabilizing institution, not because it replaces the empire directly, but because it operates across regions and offers continuity where imperial authority has fractured. What survives in the record suggests a world not of sudden collapse into chaos, but of gradual transformation into something less centralized, less uniform, but still deeply shaped by Rome. This pattern repeats across the former Western provinces. In Gaul, Spain, and North Africa, new kingdoms emerge: Visigothic, Burgundian, Frankish, Vandal, each ruling territories that were once Roman provinces. These are not simply barbarian worlds replacing Roman ones. They are hybrid systems. Roman law continues to influence governance. Roman tax systems are sometimes preserved, sometimes adapted. Roman cities remain, though often reduced in scale or function. Roman elites, where they survive, negotiate their place within the new order. Some serve new kings, some retreat into local influence, some align themselves more closely with the church. The transition is uneven region by region, but it is rarely a clean break. The kings who now rule these lands understand something crucial: Rome still matters, not as an active empire in the West, but as a source of legitimacy. To rule effectively, they must appear not as destroyers of order, but as inheritors of it. Titles are adopted. Roman bureaucrats are employed. Laws are written in ways that echo imperial traditions. Even those who fought Rome most fiercely often govern in ways that look strikingly Roman when viewed from a distance. This is not hypocrisy. It is practicality. Rome's administrative system, however weakened, remains one of the most effective ways to organize large territories. Abandoning it entirely would mean starting from nothing. There is also a deeper cultural persistence. Latin remains the language of administration, law, and educated life across much of the West. Roads, aqueducts, and cities continue to shape movement and settlement. Agricultural systems do not disappear overnight. Trade networks shrink and shift, but do not vanish completely. The Roman calendar. Roman measures and Roman habits of record-keeping linger. In some places, the physical presence of Rome, its ruins, its walls, its monumental architecture, continues to dominate the landscape so completely that it becomes part of how people understand their own place in time. They live among the remains of something larger than themselves, even if they no longer belong to it in the same way. And then there is the Eastern Empire, which complicates everything. While the West fragments the East, what later generations will call the Byzantine Empire continues to exist, adapt, and govern. It is still Roman. Its emperors still call themselves Roman emperors. Its administration is still Roman in structure, even as Greek becomes more dominant in language. Its armies still defend frontiers. Its laws still evolve within a Roman framework. From Constantinople, the idea of Rome remains alive, not as memory, but as active political reality. This matters because it shows that Rome was not simply a Western phenomenon. The empire that was destroyed in the West continues in the East for nearly another 1,000 years. That continuity is often overlooked because the cultural and linguistic shifts make it seem like something different. But to those living within it, it is Rome. The Western Empire has been destroyed, but the Roman Empire itself has not entirely ended. It has changed shape. This creates a strange historical echo. In the West, people live in a post-Roman political world while still surrounded by Roman structures. In the East, people live in a Roman political world that is slowly becoming culturally distinct from its Western origins. The unity that once defined the empire is gone, but the idea of Rome persists in multiple forms at once. This is not a clean ending. It is a transformation so deep that later generations struggled to describe it without simplifying it into collapse. There is a lesser known but telling detail in how law survives this transition. In many of the new Western kingdoms, Roman law continues to apply to Roman populations, while different legal traditions apply to the ruling groups. Over time, these systems interact, merge, or evolve. But the fact that Roman law remains relevant at all is significant. Law is one of the most enduring tools of empire. It shapes expectations, property identity, and conflict resolution. Its survival shows that Rome's influence is not dependent solely on armies or emperors. It is embedded in how people organize their lives. Religion also plays a crucial role in continuity. Christianity, which had become deeply integrated into the imperial system, now operates across the fragmented West as a unifying force of a different kind. Bishops maintain networks of communication. Churches provide social stability. Religious authority sometimes replaces or supplements political authority in local contexts. This does not mean the church simply takes over where the empire left off. It means that one of the empire's most important institutions continues to function even as the political structure that supported it disappears. In doing so, it carries forward elements of Roman identity into a new age. What emerges from all this is not a world without Rome, but a world in which Rome has been broken into pieces and distributed across new forms. The Western Empire is gone, but its influence is everywhere. It is in the laws that govern land and inheritance. It is in the cities that still anchor regional life. It is in the language of power and administration. It is in the memory of order that new rulers must imitate if they want to be taken seriously. This is why the destruction of the Western Roman Empire is so complex. It is not the disappearance of a civilization. It is the destruction of a political system that had held that civilization together. The pieces remain, but they are no longer unified. They drift, adapt, and recombine in new ways. Some regions retain more continuity than others. Some lose more quickly. Some transform into entirely new political and cultural identities over time. And yet, even as Rome survives in fragments, something essential has been lost. The ability to coordinate across continents. The ability to project unified authority. The ability to maintain large-scale stability over long distances. The ability to turn immense resources into a single coherent system. That is what the empire provided at its height, and that is what its destruction removes. The world that follows is smaller in its connections, more local in its focus, and more dependent on personal power than institutional structure. The legacy of Rome is therefore double-edged. It is a foundation for the future shaping medieval Europe in ways that will persist for centuries. But it is also a reminder of what has been lost. The ruins are not just monuments. They are evidence of a scale of organization that no longer exists in the West. People live among them, use them, and adapt them, but they also recognize, at least dimly, that they belong to a different kind of world. Rome after Rome is not an ending. It is an afterlife. A long uneven continuation in which the empire's shadow stretches across new kingdoms, new identities, and new forms of power. The Western Empire has been destroyed, but Rome itself remains changed, diminished and dispersed, yet still shaping the world that follows. In the end, the destruction of the Western Roman Empire does not belong to one enemy, one emperor, or one decision. It belongs to a pattern, a slow convergence of forces that the empire could not control, even as it continued to speak in the language of control. Rome is not destroyed because it suddenly forgets how to rule. It is destroyed because the conditions that once made its rule possible begin to fail all at once, and every attempt to repair one weakness feeds another. There is a natural instinct to assign blame outward, to point to the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, and say that Rome fell because it was invaded. An invasion is undeniably part of the story. Armies cross borders, provinces are taken, cities are looted, political authority is replaced. But those invasions succeed not because Rome is empty, but because Rome is divided. The Empire's enemies do not break a unified system. They exploit a fractured one. They enter a world already shaped by civil war, mistrust, administrative strain, and weakening loyalty. In that sense, Rome is not simply attacked, it is opened. There is an equally strong instinct to look inward, to argue that Rome decays from within, that corruption, decadence, or moral weakness erode its foundations until collapse becomes inevitable. There is some truth here, but it is often overstated or misunderstood. The late Empire is not a society that has given up on itself. It is a society under pressure, still functioning, still producing law, still raising armies, still negotiating survival. Its problem is not laziness or moral collapse in any simple sense. Its problem is that it becomes too complex, too stretched, and too internally competitive to respond effectively to sustained crisis. The real story lies in the interaction between these forces. Rome creates a world large enough to attract migration, rich enough to be worth taking, and complex enough to be difficult to defend. It builds frontiers that depend on constant attention armies, that depend on constant funding, and political systems that depend on cooperation between powerful individuals who rarely trust one another. When that balance holds, the Empire appears unbreakable. When it begins to fail, every part of the system amplifies the failure. Civil war drains the army. A weakened army invites invasion. Invasion disrupts taxation. Disrupted taxation weakens the state. A weakened state relies more on negotiated power. Negotiated power creates new rivals. New rivals fuel more instability. The cycle feeds itself. At no point does a single decision doom the Empire. At every point, small decisions made under pressure accumulate into structural collapse. And perhaps most unsettling of all, much of this happens while the Empire still looks alive. Laws are still written. Titles are still granted. Cities are still inhabited. People still call themselves Roman. The destruction is not immediately visible because it does not begin with ruins. It begins with disconnection, with the slow breakdown of the relationships that allow a system this large to function. By the time the Western Empire formally disappears, most of that work has already been done. The Emperor is removed not because the Empire is suddenly overthrown, but because the role itself no longer holds the power it once did. The system has been dismantled piece by piece until the final act is almost quiet. So who destroyed Rome? Not a single enemy army, not a single corrupt emperor, not a single fatal mistake. Rome was destroyed by the combination of pressures it could no longer balance. It was destroyed by leaders who feared each other more than they feared collapse. It was destroyed by a system that depended on cooperation but produced rivalry. It was destroyed by success so vast that it created problems too large to manage. It was destroyed by the very world it built. And in that sense, the fall of the Western Roman Empire is not just a story about the past. It is a pattern that repeats in different forms across history. Great systems do not always fail because they are weak. They fail because they become too complex, too interconnected, and too dependent on fragile balances that cannot survive sustained strain. Rome did not collapse in a single moment. It was slowly, relentlessly, and irreversibly destroyed while it was still standing. In the fading light of that long history, what remains is not only the memory of loss, but the shape of endurance. The roads, though broken in places, still trace their lines across continents. The cities, even reduced, still anchor human life. The language of law, authority, and governance continues to echo through new kingdoms that once stood at Rome's edges. The empire as a political force is gone in the West, but the world it created does not disappear with it. There is something quiet in that realization. Civilizations do not vanish as cleanly as they appear in retrospect. They linger, they fragment, they leave behind patterns that others follow without always understanding where they came from. The people who lived through Rome's final centuries did not stand at the edge of a clear ending. They adapted, endured, and carried pieces of that world forward often, without knowing how much had already changed. The ruins we see today are not just reminders of collapse. They are reminders of scale of what was once possible, and of how difficult it is to hold something that large together over time. They speak of ambition, organization, and human effort stretched across generations. But they also speak of limits, of the point at which even the most powerful systems begin to fracture under their own weight and the pressures around them. In the end, Rome's story is not only about destruction, it is about transformation. The empire disappears, but its influence reshapes the world that follows. New societies rise on its foundations, inheriting its strengths and its weaknesses. The past does not end. It becomes part of everything that comes after. And somewhere in that long transition between the last emperor and the first king who no longer needs one, the Roman world does not simply fall. It becomes something else.